The Billionaire's Christmas Wish. A Christmas on Palmar Island Romance. Written by Susanne. Chapter 1. Merry Christmas, Mr. Maxwell, the pilot said as Chris exited the jet. The same to you. Chris smiled at Jack Brown, who'd been flying him around the globe for the past 3 years. Enjoy the time with your family. I'll see you back here on the 26th. Jack nodded and pulled out his phone. We'll be ready for takeoff at 6:30 p.m. Let me know if that changes, or if you need me to come back here sooner. Chris nodded his thanks. Will do. He stepped out onto the rollaway staircase and started making his way down to the runway. The rental car was waiting for him in the parking lot of the small Myrtle Beach airport. Sam had come through, not that he expected anything less from his competent friend. He tossed his small suitcase in the trunk and got settled in the car. The Infiniti QX80 was well equipped, but wouldn't stand out like a sore thumb on Palmar Island. The address to the beach cottage Sam had made him rent for the entire month of December was programmed into the GPS. Chris started making his way out of the airport and onto the highway leading down to Palmar Island. It was a barrier island, just off the coast, connected to the mainland via 2 long bridges. His phone rang. Chris wasn't surprised to see that the caller was one of his closest friends from college, Samantha Sutton. Sam was the kind of friend who had not only arranged this trip for him, but who also saved him from what could have been the biggest mistake of his life last year. Hi Sam, checking up on me, he asked. Just making sure you made it okay. How was your flight? Sam sounded busy. There was a light hum of conversation and the occasional person yelling in the background. Uneventful. I'm on my way down to the island right now. You're going to love Miss Doris. I've known her since I was a little girl. My grandparents owned the house next door. She has a heart of gold and will take great care of you. He could hear Sam turn away from the phone to answer a question. Something about a Christmas party. Busy day, he asked when Sam returned to their conversation. Yes, and that's a good thing. We're breathing new life into the old country club. I've got some big plans that I can't wait to tell you about. I'm so glad you came out here for the holidays. Not like I had much of a choice in the matter, Chris replied. You strong-armed me into spending the next 4 weeks down here in South Carolina. I'm going to be bored out of my mind. This is exactly what you need. Trust me. Can't risk having you turn into a Scrooge. Chris noticed her voice take on that tone that told everyone who knew the savvy young businesswoman that there was no sense in arguing. And you're not going to be bored. You're going to relax. Once Sam made up her mind, that was that. I had to get you out of Colorado, or you would have spent the time working yourself to death. Chris knew she was right. The Scrooge comment stung though. He used to love Christmas. Now, working long hours until he was ready to pass out had become his way of dealing with last Christmas's disaster. But with no new app to work on until the first of the year, there wasn't much to do at the office. Hanging out on the beach for the next few weeks was better than staying in Denver and making everyone around him miserable. Hey, some of us have to work for a living. We can't all inherit those billions from our daddy, Chris said. Sam snorted. Like I'm not working my butt off. Come by the country club while you're down here and I'll show you how I'm making my living these days. Chris could hear urgent chatter in the background. I'll let you go. Call me later. I'd love to come up and see you and that golf course project of yours. It's about time I meet your husband too. Sounds like a plan. Say hi to Miss Doris from me. Chris hung up the phone and settled in for the 45-minute drive to the house of the mysterious Miss Doris Sam held in such high regards. Chris got out of his car and stretched. Between the flight and the drive, he was ready to go for a run to loosen up those tight muscles. First though, he'd have to meet his temporary landlady and get settled into the place he would call home for much of December. The island was gorgeous, with its wide beaches, rolling waves, and large live oak trees covered in Spanish moss. There were plenty of things to do from what he'd seen so far, but none of the large hotels which crowded every square inch of beachfront property further up the coast. Instead, charming, older beach houses and cottages dotted the landscape. Chris grabbed his luggage and made his way up to the wide porch, complete with a swing and rocking chairs. An older woman with silver gray hair opened the door before Chris had a chance to ring the bell. "There you are. Sam called a few minutes ago to let me know you were on your way." "Chris Maxwell," he said, stretching out his hand to her. The woman ignored it and pulled him into a warm hug instead. "Call me Miss Doris. Sam has told me so much about you. You're going to love it down here," she said after letting go of him. Chris couldn't remember the last time someone other than his mom had hugged him. He shook his head and readjusted the grip on his luggage. "Where are my manners?" Miss Doris exclaimed with dismay. "Come on in." She stepped back through the door and motioned for him to follow her. They walked down a small hallway and into what he assumed was the living room of Miss Doris's beach house. "You can set your bag down right over there." Miss Doris pointed to a spot near the door. "I want to introduce you to my friend Amy." Only then did Chris notice the young woman sitting on a love seat in the corner of the room. The most stunning dark brown eyes he'd ever seen looked up at him. They had an innocence and openness that took his breath away. He shook his head to clear it and put his bag down on the floor as directed. Kais had to remind himself that women were trouble, and he was sure this beauty was no exception. "Amy, this is Chris Maxwell, a friend of Sam's who'll be staying in the cottage through Christmas." Amy set the coffee cup she'd been holding down and rose. He couldn't keep his eyes from her as she walked across the room to shake his hand. "Amy is a good friend of mine. She runs the local flower shop and is helping me organize this year's Christmas parade," Miss Doris said. "How about a cup of coffee before I show you the cottage out back?" Chris was about to decline. He wanted a shower and was itching to go for a run on the beach. The weather was mild for early December, even down here, with temperatures in the mid to high 50s. He glanced over at Amy, who had returned to her seat. He didn't know what it was about her, but he was curious about her. He wanted a chance to get to know her a little better. "Coffee would be nice, thank you," he said before taking a seat across from Amy. Miss Doris went to the kitchen to pour him a cup, leaving him alone with the young woman. "How long have you had your shop?" he asked. 3 years. Amy's voice was soft. He had to strain to hear her. She looked shy and more than a little uncomfortable in his presence. He continued to make small talk, but wasn't able to get more than a polite reply here and there out of her. It was maddening. To his relief, Miss Doris returned quickly with a cup and a fresh pot of coffee. "Here you go." She handed Chris his coffee and joined Amy on the small sofa. "Amy and I were chatting about this year's Christmas parade. She's helping me get it all organized this year. It's not a big event, but we have a lot of fun, don't we?" Miss Doris looked over at Amy, who smiled and self-consciously pushed her hair behind her ear. Amy nodded, but didn't say anything. It was driving Chris nuts. He wanted to listen to her speak, wanted to learn a little more about her. He wasn't sure where that desire came from. The last thing on his mind when he touched down in South Carolina was women. "I hope you're ready for lots of holiday festivities, Mr. Maxwell," Miss Doris said. He looked up and saw the older woman's eyes flit between him and Amy, a small smile playing around her lips. "Call me Chris," he said. "If I'm perfectly honest, I'm not a big fan of Christmas these days. It starts before Thanksgiving and you can't make it through the day without hearing Christmas tunes and seeing Santas on every corner. And don't even get me started on how commercialized it's become." Chris stopped when he noticed the shock and dismay in both women's eyes. "I'm sorry. That was rude, and it sounded harsher than I meant it. I'm sure the island's Christmas activities are lovely, and I look forward to seeing the parade." He finished his coffee and stood. "If you don't mind, I would like to get settled in." "Of course, follow me." Miss Doris stood and walked to the sliding glass door that led out to the large back deck. The house overlooked the ocean and the salty breeze hit his face. He took a deep, calming breath and looked out over the churning sea. He definitely needed to go for a run as soon as possible. He noticed a young pregnant woman who walked off the beach and up on the deck. "Sarah," Miss Doris said. "Come meet Mr. Maxwell. He's renting the guest cottage through Christmas." "It's nice to meet you," Sarah said. "I hope you enjoy your stay. You couldn't have chosen a kinder landlady." A smile lit up the young woman's face as she looked at Miss Doris. "Sarah is my great-niece," Miss Doris explained. "She's expecting." Chris smiled. "I assumed as much. When are you due?" "Just after Christmas." Sarah winced and put a hand to her protruding belly. "I hate to cut this short, but I have got to get off my feet. I'm sure I'll be seeing you around, Mr. Maxwell." "Call me Chris," he said before watching her waddle across the deck and disappear into the main house. "I should warn you. I put up Christmas decorations to make the place a little more festive. I will come over to take them down as soon as Amy leaves." The older woman turned and looked right at him, her eyes holding as much challenge as apology. "That won't be necessary. A few decorations would be nice." "I had as you." Chris paused and ran his fingers through his hair. "Let's just say I had a bad Christmas last year. I'm doing my best to get over it. Maybe this place will help me do that. This used to be my favorite time of the year." Chris followed Miss Doris across the deck and through the yard over to the small guest cottage. Small being the operative word. The place was tiny. Nothing more than a small living room with a kitchenette, a bathroom and a bedroom loft. The entire building could fit into the bedroom of his Denver condo. But it would do. Change was good. Sam had convinced him of that, well, almost. "I'll let you get settled in. Please stop by the house anytime. A friend of Sam's is a friend of mine." He nodded and Miss Doris left. Chris dropped his bag in the middle of the room and climbed up to the loft. The bed was surprisingly comfortable and the attic window had a view of the ocean. He could see a few people walking on the beach and decided to head out for that run. He needed to clear his head and get the image of Amy sitting on the small sofa, smiling at him shyly, out of his head. How in the world had he ended up in a place that screamed Christmas, with people who insisted on getting to know him? All he wanted out of this trip was peace and quiet, and a chance to forget all about this particular holiday. He changed into his workout clothes and laced up his sneakers before heading down to the beach. It was going to be an interesting December. Chapter 2. "Let me get the door for you." Chloe ran up ahead of Amy and unlocked the back door of the Happy Florist. What would she do without her friend and shop assistant? Amy stepped out carrying a tray of poinsettia plants. "Thank you." Amy put the plants down and dug around in the pocket of her long wool skirt for her keys. "I'll grab the next batch," Chloe said before returning to the shop. Amy unlocked the back of the old Ford Transit van she used for deliveries, and started stacking the delicate holiday plants. "These are for the display at the church, right?" Chloe asked as she handed Amy the next few plants. "Yes. I'm heading over there first thing in the morning. Reverend Peters wants them in place for Sunday service." "Do you need me to help you?" Chloe asked. Amy knew her assistant was a single mom and would have to bring her preschooler on a Saturday morning. Having Toby running around the church while they were busy arranging the plants into 2 tall poinsettia tree displays would be less than helpful. "Not necessary." Amy waved her hand dismissively before grabbing another plant from Chloe. "Miss Doris offered to help, and the Reverend will be there as well." "We'll be fine. Enjoy your day off." Amy could see the relief in her friend's face and knew she'd made the right call. "Anything fun planned for the weekend?" "I promised Toby we'd go see Santa. I'll probably take him over to the big mall in Myrtle Beach. He's getting so excited." Chloe's face lit up when she talked about her 4-year-old son. This is the first year that he gets the whole Santa thing. He's making a list of everything he wants to ask for. I remember those. I used to help my little brother write a letter to Santa each year. Somehow my dad always managed to get everything on our lists. Well, except the pony. They both laughed. How is Miss Doris? Are the two of you getting busy organizing the parade? Chloe shifted some of the plants in the back of the van to make room for a few more. We are. I went over there yesterday after we closed. She has the whole thing just about ready to go. All we need are a few sponsors, and to assign teams to do the actual float building a few days before the parade. I don't know why she asked me to help. Amy shook her head. Probably because she wants you to take over in a couple of years. Amy was afraid of that. She wasn't sure how she felt about approaching local businesses on her own to sponsor floats for the annual Palmar Island Christmas parade. She knew she'd never be as good as the little gray-haired lady at ordering the volunteers around to make sure everything was ready to go on the big day. She didn't have the easy confidence and people skills Miss Doris had. If Amy was completely honest with herself, she wasn't sure she wanted to be the one in charge. But who could tell Miss Doris no when she asked for your help with something? Certainly not Amy. I don't think we have to worry about that anytime soon. Miss Doris is fit as a fiddle, she said to reassure herself as much as anything. Did I tell you she has a new renter? Amy swallowed hard. And Chloe looked at her expectantly. He's from out west, staying with Miss Doris until after Christmas. I think he's a friend of the people next door to her. Spill, what does he look like? How old is he? Handsome? I bet he's handsome. Tall, dark, and definitely handsome. Chloe was bouncing with excitement. Did he ask you out on a date? Wow, slow down there. I barely spoke 5 words with him. Amy tried hard to suppress a laugh. Her friend was getting a little too excited. Chloe had made it her mission to find the perfect guy for Amy. As a single mother, Chloe didn't get a chance to date much and was determined to live vicariously through Amy, much to Amy's dismay. When are you seeing him again? Tomorrow? Maybe you could talk him into helping you, and poor old Miss Doris put the poinsettia display together. Chloe had a dangerous glimmer in the corner of her eyes. Who knows what could happen? First of all, I doubt he would want to help. Second, I probably won't even see him in the morning, so it's a moot point. Amy put the last of the potted plants Chloe had brought in the van, and made sure they were secure for the drive. And even if he's around and willing to help, decorating a church isn't exactly the best way to get to know someone. Miss Doris and the Reverend will be around, keeping an eye on everyone. That's if he's even interested. Amy shrugged as she turned around. You never know. There's magic in the air this time of the year. I can feel it. Chloe was ever the optimist. Amy snorted. I doubt that. Plus, you know how I feel about romance. Amy climbed out of the van and found herself enveloped in a hug. Don't give up on love, okay? Chloe whispered before letting her go. If I still believe there's someone out there just waiting to have Toby and me in his life, you should too. I'll try, Amy conceded. They'd had this conversation multiple times over the years they'd been friends, and Chloe knew enough about Amy's childhood to realize why she had such a hard time with the idea of being and staying in love. That's all I'm asking, Chloe said as they walked back to the shop to pick up more of the red and green plants. Let me grab your paycheck, Amy said before heading to the small desk in the back that functioned as her office. Duke, her 2-year-old beagle, was sleeping on her chair. He raised his head and looked at her. Amy petted him reassuringly. We're almost done here. I'll come get you as soon as I finish loading the plants. She pulled one of the homemade dog treats from the glass container on her desk and handed it to the young beagle. It was a crunchy biscuit and would keep him entertained until it was time to go home. You talk to him like he understands. Chloe shook her head. While she didn't mind having Duke around all day, Amy knew she wasn't a dog person. Or a pet person in general. Amy gave Duke one last pat on the head and grabbed Chloe's check. Here you go. I can't thank you enough for this job, Amy, Chloe said as she pushed the door open with her back. I'm finally making enough to buy Toby some real gifts. He's going to be so excited Christmas morning. Amy forced herself to return the smile. You deserve it. You're by far the most competent assistant I've worked with. And you're a great friend. She climbed back into the van and pushed the plants around to make room for the last few containers. Being able to hide her face so Chloe couldn't see the uncertainty of their future in her eyes was a bonus. Why don't you head on home? I'm almost done loading these, Amy said without turning her head. Are you sure? Chloe asked. Absolutely. There's nothing else to do except lock up. Go on home and spend some time with Toby. Chloe thanked her and didn't waste any time to get into her old, beat-up Toyota Corolla. By the time Amy walked back to the shop to grab the remaining plants, Chloe was waving at her as she pulled out of the parking lot. Miss Gardner, I'm glad I caught you. Amy almost dropped the poinsettias. She knew that voice. It was the landlord who had made her life miserable for the past year, since he'd bought the building that housed her pride and joy, her little flower shop. Hello, Mr. Leonard. What can I do for you? She asked, doing her best to keep her voice and expression friendly. I came by to let you know that I heard about your little chat with the city council, he said as he stepped closer. Amy held the poinsettia plant in front of her like a shield. She didn't know why she let this man intimidate her so much. She'd had a bad feeling about him since he stopped by the shop to introduce himself as the new building owner. Believe me, none of the council members will come to your rescue, Mr. Leonard said with a sneer. You can forget about getting the plumbing fixed, and the awning over the shop looks fine to me. If you feel the need to have the latest and greatest window cover, you can buy it yourself. I'm not paying to advertise your little flower shop. He looked at her with a smug grin on his face that showed his tobacco-stained teeth. Amy hated it when the older man stared her down, the way he was doing right now. It's not about looks. Amy took a deep breath. It's a safety issue. The awning could fall down at any moment and hit a customer, Amy said shakily. She hated that she didn't have the confidence to speak up and give Mr. Leonard a piece of her mind. He turned around and looked at the tattered and rusted contraption hanging over the door and two large windows that made up her shop front. Looks perfectly sound to me. Like I said, you're welcome to replace it yourself. He turned back around to face her. The other thing is about the rent. There will be a 10% increase, effective January 1st. He looked at her with a raised eyebrow, challenging her to say something. Amy just nodded. She knew complaining about a second rent increase in less than 6 months would do her no good. Of course you're welcome to leave any time. I'm not going to hold you to the lease you signed with the previous owner. He looked at her expectantly. That was the whole point of his refusal to work on the building, and as she had to guess, the reason for the rent increases. Robert Leonard had bought her building and the ones on either side over the course of the past year. Gossip around town was that he had big plans for the properties, which involved tearing down the existing buildings and developing a large new shopping and condo complex. Of course that involved getting the current tenants out first. And like herself, most tenants in the buildings had existing leases that couldn't be broken, unless there was a mutual agreement. Thank you for letting me know, Amy said. I'll have a check in the mail to you by the end of the month. Now, if you'll excuse me, she looked at Mr. Leonard and then over to the van she was loading. Much to her relief, he nodded and walked to the store next door. Amy let out a deep breath and set the last plant in the van. She walked back to the shop to close up for the night. Ready to go home, Duke? She couldn't help but smile when she watched the young dog jump down from the chair and run to the door. He was ready to head home and go on a long walk through their neighborhood. Without the walk, there was no telling what he would do to keep himself entertained while she slept. In the past 6 months, she'd learned the hard way that the best way to make sure Duke behaved was to wear him out with plenty of physical exercise. After that, she decided, she would make a big mug of hot chocolate and they would curl up on the couch. She'd worry about keeping the shop afloat tomorrow. Amy took a sip of freshly brewed coffee from her travel mug before stepping out of the van. She was halfway up the walkway when the front door opened. Miss Doris stepped out in slacks and a Christmas sweater with an adorable reindeer on it. "Don't you love my new shirt?" Miss Doris asked. "I'm Team Rudolph." She pulled her shirt out, grinning at Amy. "Very pretty." Amy didn't even bat an eyelash at her friend in the outfit. Miss Doris loved Christmas, and had her decorations up the day after Thanksgiving. Christmas sweaters were her thing, and she'd acquired quite the collection over the years. Amy felt slightly underdressed in her plain red sweater and jeans. "I got you something," Miss Doris said, digging around in her purse. "I saw this at Kate's gift shop this morning. I got one for you and one for Sarah. Ah, here it is." She pulled a small item in a clear plastic bag out of her purse. The bag was tied with a bit of red ribbon. Miss Doris handed the gift to Amy. Inside the bag was a holly pen. Amy opened the bag and pulled it out. "This is beautiful." "Thank you." Miss Doris took the enamel brooch from her hand. "Here, let me put it on you. It'll look nice with your sweater." She fastened it on Amy's sweater and stepped back. A pleased smile lit up her face. "Perfect. I knew you girls would like these the moment I saw them. How is Sarah?" Amy hadn't seen Miss Doris's great-niece for a couple of days. She knew the young woman was 8 months pregnant. Since Sarah had moved in at Miss Doris's a few months ago after getting kicked out by her mother, they had become friendly. Amy wasn't surprised about what Sarah's mother had done, but she felt for the young woman and had been happy to spend time with her at Miss Doris's suggestion. "She's doing good. Getting pretty tired. Oh, I can't wait to tell you what happened last week. You're not going to believe who she bumped into," Miss Doris whispered conspiratorially. "Sarah ran into Ryan Beckheim in front of my shop last week." "Is that what you're talking about?" Miss Doris's face fell. Amy felt bad about ruining the surprise. "But you don't know why it's such a big deal." Amy's elderly friend perked right back up. "I'll tell you on the way to church. We better not leave the Reverend waiting." Miss Doris turned to walk towards the van, then stopped. "There's Mr. Maxwell. I mean, Chris." Amy followed her gaze and sure enough, the handsome brown-haired man she'd met 2 days ago in Miss Doris's living room came jogging up the sidewalk. Amy's breath caught when she saw him in his running shorts. His legs looked lean and strong. He obviously worked out. "Good morning, ladies," Chris said. Amy noticed he wasn't breathing hard at all. Even with all the exercise she'd been getting walking Duke at least twice a day, she found herself huffing and puffing if she rushed too fast up a flight of stairs. Chris, though, seemed to be in incredible shape. Amy doubted he'd have any trouble with stairs, or lifting heavy packages. She couldn't see much of his upper body physique under the long-sleeved t-shirt he wore. The sleeves were pushed up, exposing his lower arms and hands. Those looked just as good as his legs. Amy swallowed hard, then shook her head and chided herself for ogling this man she barely knew. What was that? Warmth crept up her cheeks when she realized Chris had asked a question she'd missed. "Chris wants to know what we're doing this morning." Miss Doris smiled. She turned to Chris. "The church puts up these poinsettia trees each year, and Amy here kindly donates the plants. They are beautiful. Imagine plants all stacked up in the shape of a large Christmas tree." Miss Doris gestured to indicate the height and shape. "There'll be one on each side of the altar from now through the end of the month. It's a sight to behold. We're heading over there right now to assemble them." She pointed toward the van. "Do you need help with that?" Chris asked after Miss Doris explained how the poinsettia plants would be stacked up in metal frames. "An extra pair of hands wouldn't go amiss," Miss Doris replied. "We're about to leave." "How quickly can you be ready?" she asked. "Give me 5 minutes," Chris said before jogging to his cottage, pulling his shirt off as he got close to the door. Amy heard Miss Doris giggle beside her. "You should close your mouth before you start drooling," the older woman said, the kindness in her eyes softening the teasing words. Amy felt the warmth creeping into her cheeks, and looked down at her feet, not embarrassed much of being caught by Miss Doris, but about crushing on Chris in the first place. This wasn't her. She didn't have crushes, and she didn't fall in love. Because she knew from experience that it never ended well. It wasn't worth the risk. "I've never seen you like this," Miss Doris said. Amy looked up. "Like what?" "Acting like a little schoolgirl." Miss Doris looked into Amy's eyes and smiled. "It's nice. And if you ask me, about time. Chris seems like a good man. You couldn't have chosen better." She leaned in and whispered, "Plus, Sam tells me he's loaded." "I didn't. And I won't." Amy looked around to make sure Chris wasn't walking back yet. "I like my life the way it is. I have Duke and my shop. That's all I need to be happy." She shrugged and forced a smile, to convince herself as much as Miss Doris. "And you know I don't care about the money." "I do, honey. And I know you have your reasons, but haven't you shut yourself off from the world long enough?" "I'm not hiding." Amy lifted her head, her voice getting louder as anger built in her chest. "I'm out there every day. Not just with my shop. You know as much as anyone what I'm doing to help out in the community." She couldn't believe her friend would say something like that. Miss Doris knew her better than most people in Palmar Island. Apparently she'd been wrong. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked right at her older friend. Miss Doris chuckled. "I knew there was some fire hidden down in there somewhere," she said. "Good for you. It doesn't mean I'm not right though. I've watched you these past few years. You've gotten very good at hiding much of yourself away. Especially when you do volunteer work or run your shop. Yes, you give plenty, but don't you think it's time to open up and allow yourself to receive love in return?" Miss Doris's voice had taken a gentle, soothing tone. All mirth and teasing was gone from it. Amy's anger melted faster than a snowman in July. Miss Doris wasn't wrong. In fact, their friendship was as close as she'd let anyone into her life since before the death of her father. Amy knew that he hadn't left her intentionally, but it had been the last straw. First her mother had. Nope, she wasn't going there. After the loss, keeping people at bay had been intentional, but was it still? Holding much of herself back and guarding her heart at all costs had become her default emotional state. It had become who she was. But was it who she wanted to be? The sound of a slamming door jolted Amy out of her sobering thoughts. She turned and watched Chris, dressed in jeans and a simple black t-shirt stretched tight across his chest, walk up to them. He pulled a gray wool sweater over his head when he got there. She could smell the clean scent of soap on him when he reached to pull the door of her van open. Maybe going on a date or two with Chris wouldn't be such a horrible idea. Nothing serious, just a bit of harmless flirting and fun before he left at the end of his vacation. "Ready, ladies?" he asked. Amy turned to Miss Doris after getting into the driver's seat of her van. "You were going to tell me why it's such a big deal that Sarah met Ryan." Miss Doris giggled and then lowered her voice. "That's not the first time they've met. Turns out Ryan Beckheim is the baby's father." Thanks to Chris and a few other male volunteers the Reverend had called in to help, it didn't take long to unload the van and arrange the poinsettia plants on the 2 wrought iron stands that were already sitting in the church when Amy, Doris and Chris had arrived an hour and a half earlier. Amy sat next to Miss Doris in one of the pews. The older lady had insisted on taking a short break and getting out of the way while Chris and 2 other men were busy hooking up the intricate watering system under the close supervision of Reverend Peters. She also didn't miss the chance to tell Amy more of what she'd learned about Chris Maxwell, CEO and Billionaire. That last bit of news was more than a little intimidating. "It turned out beautifully, didn't it?" Miss Doris said as Chris walked over to them. "It's really something. My mom would love this." Chris turned around and leaned up against the side of the pew to look at the poinsettia display the small group of them had put together. The Reverend was walking back from turning on the water system to test it. He gave them a big smile and a thumbs up. That's impressive. Y'all got it hooked up right on the first try. Usually it takes a lot more fiddling and fixing stuff before it works. Miss Doris turned to Amy. Remember last year, when they flooded the church because one of the pipes wasn't connected? Amy's lips twitched, thinking back on the previous year's event. It wasn't that bad. Oh, please. I mopped up 2 full buckets of water. Miss Doris's eyes twinkled with mirth at the memory. She turned to Chris. It's nice of you to come and help out. You've been handy to have around today. Chris shrugged. Thanks. I've enjoyed it. It's been a while since I've had a chance to fix anything. My dad is the real handyman in the family. He's taught me a lot over the years. Amy couldn't help but notice how normal he seemed. Not at all like a billionaire, whatever that meant. If you want more practice, I'm sure I can come up with a project or two around the house, Miss Doris teased. Amy smiled when she saw the look of mock dismay on Chris's face. Miss Doris must have seen it as well. Don't worry. I'm not going to make you work for your stay. Her phone started ringing, and she dug around the large black leather purse she carried everywhere. Hello? Miss Doris got up and started walking toward the back of the church. What else do we need to do before we can get out of here? Chris asked, turning back to Amy. Just a little cleanup, I think, now that the water system is hooked up and running. Amy looked around the church to make sure there wasn't anything else to do. I need to take those crates back to the shop. Shouldn't take too long to load them in the van. He nodded. You donate the flowers every year, he asked. Amy nodded. The church orders their floral displays from me, and sends a good bit of wedding business my way as well. It's the least I can do. She smiled as she looked at the poinsettia trees. They were beautiful and impressive. She knew that no matter how many times she'd be lucky enough to be a part of this Palmar Island tradition, it would never get old. That was Sarah. Danny Brakefield next door needs help. Her husband was hanging Christmas lights and fell off the ladder. Danny's taking him to the emergency room to see if he just sprained his ankle, or if he broke it. Amy nodded. Someone has to watch the kids. We can head over there now. I'll come back and get the crates later. Nonsense, Miss Doris said. Sarah is already with them. Between the 2 of us, we can handle the 3 little ones until Danny gets back. I'll get a ride from Matt. He looks like he's ready to head out. You 2 finish up here. Amy, you can drop Chris off at the house when you're done. She rushed off to catch up with Matt, who was on his way out the door. Amy watched Miss Doris speak to the young man, who nodded his head in agreement before opening the church door. Let's get those crates loaded. I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some lunch. Chris put a hand to his stomach. I wouldn't mind a burger and some fries. Amy's stomach growled at the mention of food. He looked at her and smiled. Know of a place? He asked. There's Mary's. They have pretty good burgers. Amy hesitated. Mary's was a pretty casual diner. It's nothing fancy, but the food's good. That sounds great. Chris had a wide grin on his face. We can head over there on the way back. Amy rose and started stacking up plastic crates. Thank you for all your help. This would have taken much longer without you. He nodded and grabbed a second stack of crates before walking out the door and to her van. Lunch is on me, Amy said as they climbed into the vehicle a few minutes later. It's the least I can do to pay you back for your kindness today. Chris looked embarrassed as he put on his seatbelt. That was nothing, he said. It was nice to do something with my hands and actually see the results of a few hours' worth of work. Different from your day job? She asked as she pulled out of the church parking lot. Very. My company develops gaming apps, and months go into development before you see much of anything. There's no telling if it was worth the time and effort until you get it in the hands of beta players. Amy couldn't relate. Her own business was very different. She could see the work she put into each flower arrangement. She sensed there was more to this and kept quiet to see if he would say more. He didn't. "Here it is," she said as they pulled in. Mary's was your typical small-town diner. The building had seen better days, but there was always a crowd, especially at lunchtime. They got lucky and were seated in one of the roomy booths within minutes. "You worked with your dad?" Amy asked after they'd placed their order. "Just basic home improvement stuff. He worked for the post office, but was always fixing things around the house and the yard. I picked up a couple of things here and there helping him." Chris smiled as he lifted his Coke and drank most of it in one long gulp. "I was thirstier than I thought." "Ready for a refill?" Cindy, their waitress, held her hand out for his glass. "Food should be out in a few minutes." Chris nodded his thanks. "Your dad is retired?" Amy asked, picking the conversation back up after the brief interruption. She took a sip of the sweet tea she had ordered. The smell of Mary's home-cooked food made her mouth water, and she hoped Cindy was right about their order being almost ready. "Yes, he stopped working last year. He and my mom have been enjoying retirement ever since. They finally get to travel and do all the things they put off while they raised me and my sister." "Are they coming down for Christmas?" Miss Doris had mentioned that Chris was renting the cottage until after the holidays. "No, they are on a cruise through the first week of January." "Oh no, they'll miss Christmas with you," Amy blurted out before covering her mouth with her hand. "Trust me, that's a good thing. Actually, it's why I sent them on the cruise in the first place," Chris admitted. He grabbed the napkin and unrolled it, revealing the silverware inside. He set the fork and knife in front of him, before folding the napkin in half and placing it on his leg. "How come?" Amy asked, hoping he wouldn't think her nosy. "Let's just say last Christmas didn't work out as well as I'd hoped, and I knew I wouldn't be good company this year." That explained his reaction to all the talk about Christmas, and why he'd apparently taken down most of the decorations in the cottage. It broke Amy's heart to think that whatever had happened had ruined Christmas for him. It was her favorite time of the year. "I surprised them with a cruise that's taking them around the world for 3 months, Chris continued. Amy was impressed. "That sounds like the trip of a lifetime," she said. "I wanted to do something nice for them, and they'd always planned on traveling once Dad retired. They are having a great time." He picked up his phone and showed her a picture of an older couple standing in front of the Acropolis in Greece. Both the man and the woman were beaming, clearly enjoying themselves. "What an incredible gift," Amy said. Chris smiled and looked like he was ready to say something in return. He looked up and across her shoulder. "Here comes the food. What about you? Is the flower shop a family business?" Chris asked, before taking a big bite of the mushroom and Swiss burger Cindy had set in front of him. Amy stirred the gumbo she'd ordered. "No, I opened the shop 3 years ago. I moved to Palmar Island to get a fresh start, but it's quickly become home." She carefully tasted her food, making sure it wasn't so hot it would burn her lips. Mary always served her soups and stews piping hot and with a side of homemade cornbread. The gumbo was no different. "Business is good then?" he asked as he picked up several sweet potato fries and dipped them in the homemade honey mustard dressing. "I stay busy. December is a little slow, but the rest of the year we get a lot of wedding business. Palmar Island is a popular wedding and honeymoon destination." Chris nodded. "I can see that. It's a beautiful place. I love the little chapel by the water." "I do too." She delivered flowers there most weekends throughout the year. It was usually booked months in advance for wedding ceremonies. Their conversation slowed as they both enjoyed their food. Amy found she really was hungry. The work at church had helped her build up quite an appetite, and it didn't take her long to finish the gumbo and cornbread. When Cindy brought the check for their late lunch, Chris grabbed the small dark leather folder. "Hey, lunch is on me," Amy protested, to no avail. Chris shook his head. "No way. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed a meal this much. Let me pay for it." He pulled several bills from his wallet and tucked them into the folder. "Plus, I'm trying to stay in your good graces so you take me home," he said before getting up. Amy laughed. How could she argue with that? Chapter 3. Chris woke up the next morning to a loud banging noise. It took him a moment to realize someone was knocking at the door of the cottage. "Coming," he yelled while untangling the covering he was sleeping under. He'd figured out quickly that the sleeping loft of the cottage stayed nice and warm. Chris didn't need a thick down comforter like the one he used in his cabin in the Colorado Rockies, or the slightly less warm one on his bed in the condo in Denver. The thin quilt Miss Doris had on the bed was plenty warm, even in early December. He climbed down the steep stairs, more of a ladder really, that led up to the sleeping loft. He went slowly, remembering that he'd almost fallen down half the steps the first night he'd slept here. He'd left his phone downstairs, and it had started ringing shortly after he'd fallen asleep. His CFO had called with questions about fourth quarter projections, forgetting that Chris was on East Coast time. He finally made it downstairs and grabbed a sweater before unlocking and opening the door. "Good morning," Miss Doris said in a cheery voice. It was way too early for this much positivity, Chris thought, as he ran his fingers through his disheveled hair. "I brought you some muffins, and I'm here to pick up those Christmas decorations." She walked right in and set the basket of fresh baked goods on the kitchen counter. "Any plans with Amy today?" she asked as she started to make coffee. Chris was too stunned to do anything but shake his head. "That's too bad. You two seemed to get along so well yesterday. I hope you at least got her number." She leaned in close. "If not, I can give it to you." "It's not like that," Chris replied. "I'm here to relax for a few weeks, before my company starts work on a new project after the holidays." Miss Doris nodded and turned the coffee maker on. It started to gurgle, and within a few minutes the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with that of the muffins. It was a nice, homey smell, and he didn't have the heart to ask his nosy landlord to leave. Instead, he pulled 2 mugs and 2 plates from the cabinet and set them on the kitchen table. Miss Doris poured the coffee and picked up a muffin before sitting down. "I see you left a few of the decorations up. I'll bring a basket over in a bit and we can take them down as well." "Not necessary," Chris said with a smile. "I like them. I think I'll keep them, for now." Miss Doris nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "A little Christmas spirit doesn't hurt," she said before biting into her muffin. Chris followed suit. He could taste the apple and cinnamon. The muffin was still warm and one of the best things he'd eaten in a while, even after the burger at Mary's yesterday. He'd have to go out for another run after this. If he wasn't careful, he'd leave the island with a few extra pounds by the end of the month. His mother would be pleased. She always complained that he was too skinny, and tried to convince him to come over for dinner more often, so she could put some meat on his bones. He missed his parents. The thought hit him out of nowhere, and it was a strange feeling. He'd done everything he could to avoid family and close friends for the past 11 months. If he was truthful with himself, he'd started distancing himself from his mom and dad long before that. He'd told himself it was part of growing up and gaining his independence, but with the gift of hindsight he saw it for what it was. He'd been selfish and out to prove himself. Showering his family with gifts now that he'd found financial and professional success was one thing. But it wasn't everything. He would call them at their next scheduled day in port. He walked across the room to grab his phone from the counter. "Everything okay?" Miss Doris said as he sat back down and started typing away on his phone. "Yes, of course." He looked up and realized what he'd done. "I'm sorry. I was thinking about my parents, and asked my assistant to email me their travel itinerary." Miss Doris nodded knowingly. "We miss family this time of the year, don't we?" "Yes." He didn't know what else to say. He hated the look of sadness on her face. "My husband has been gone for over 20 years now, but I still miss him, especially around Christmas. He loved everything about it. That's why I decorate so much. It brings back memories." Chris looked at her and saw her face change from sad to wistful and maybe even happy. "Love is a powerful thing," she told him after she'd finished her muffin and her coffee. "You'll learn that soon enough." She stood and put her mug and plate in the sink. She picked up the box of Christmas decorations he'd packed up and stored next to the couch. With a quick goodbye she left. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the older woman was up to something as he closed the door behind her. He couldn't quite put his finger on it though. His phone beeped. He pulled it out of his pocket and saw an email from his assistant with the day-by-day breakdown of his parents' trip. They would be at sea for the next 3 days. The phone call would have to wait. He finished his own coffee and decided to distract himself by doing a little work. He brought the files for his company's next project with him. He opened his laptop and looked through the preliminary information. His team had gathered information on several popular holiday-themed mobile games. Up until now, he'd done his best to avoid getting too involved in the project. It was time to change that. Maybe he should start by doing a little research. He downloaded a game called Santa's Workshop on his phone and started playing. It wasn't a bad little app and he was surprised that the Christmas theme didn't bother him. The graphics were cute, and it was easy enough to get into it. He made a few notes on his laptop and then got back into the game. Before long he was stretched out on the couch, absorbed in playing the game. He was busy crafting Christmas gifts and solving puzzles to gain food for the baby reindeer he was raising. By the time he finished baking a batch of sparkly sugar cookies with his fellow elves, his phone rang. Chris was shocked at how low his battery was. A look at the time confirmed that the game wasn't a battery drainer. It was engaging. He'd been playing for hours. That's why he was almost out of power. They would definitely need to study this particular app and see what they could implement in their own. "Hi Sam," he said when he answered the call. He got up to look for the charger in his briefcase. "Do you have plans for lunch today?" Sam asked. "Not yet," he said. "But I have a feeling I'm about to. Why don't you come up to the club for lunch?" "My carbon offset agent just canceled, and I'm free until 5, Sam said. "You're what?" Chris asked. "Never mind. Just come on up here." "What were you talking about earlier? You have a carbon fiber rep? New type of golf club?" Chris asked. He didn't play himself, but assumed carbon fiber golf clubs were a thing. No, Sam didn't even try to suppress her laugh. "I was meeting with someone from a carbon offset credit agency. It's one of the ways we're making Willow Run more profitable." She pointed to the large wooded area that surrounded several of the holes. They continued to walk the property while Sam explained to him how this whole carbon credit system worked. It was a brilliant concept and something he'd have to look into if he ever acquired more land in the Colorado mountains. Who knew you could make money by owning trees, swamps, and meadows? "You're doing everything you can to turn this place around, aren't you?" he asked his longtime friend. "Of course I am. This place has been in Jason's family for decades and most of our employees have been working here for almost that long. I'd hate for them to lose their jobs. If we can pull this off, we'll create a thriving business that will support everyone for another generation or two." Chris was surprised, not only at Sam's enthusiasm for this project, but also at her mention of the future. "You're thinking of having kids?" he asked. "Not just thinking." Sam giggled. "Let's just say we're trying. And don't you dare tell my brothers. Or my mother." Chris knew Sam's family and could understand why she wanted to keep that particular news under wraps for a little while longer. "Your secret is safe with me," he said before pretending to lock his mouth with a key. "You remember?" Sam sounded astonished that he used the small gesture they'd started using in college when they'd first become friends. "Of course. And congratulations. You're going to make a wonderful mother." He meant it. Sam was one of the kindest and most caring people he knew. Aside from Amy. They hadn't spent a lot of time together, but watching her work on the display at church and how she was willing to drop everything to help Miss Doris's neighbor had told him enough. I don't know about that, but Jason is going to be an amazing dad. Sam's face beamed with joy and pride. When do I get to meet the lucky guy? He asked. He hadn't made it to Sam and Jason's impromptu wedding, or the official celebration a few months later. He had yet to meet his friend's new husband and the co-owner of the Willow Run Golf Club. I'm sure we'll run into him. He's around here somewhere, probably walking the course, trying to decide how he can return the property to a more natural state. Sam walked ahead of him up the path to the clubhouse. I want to show you what we've done to the building. Then we'll grab some lunch. They have a pretty mean club sandwich. He liked seeing her this enthusiastic. Lead the way. Sam walked him through several large rooms and explained that they were multifunctional entertainment spaces. This one, for example, works really well as a wedding venue. Our team is setting it up for an event this weekend. Chris saw several people arranging tables and chairs. A guy in overalls was busy putting together what looked like a sound system on a small raised platform off to the side. You're getting a lot of events business, he asked Sam as they walked through an adjacent room with a set of French doors leading out to a small side patio. It would make a good place for a more intimate gathering. A small wedding, an anniversary party, or a birthday, he thought. We do. Word is getting around, and the calendar is starting to fill up quickly. I've met several wedding planners in the area who are happy to recommend us to their clients. Sam looked proud, and rightfully so. You're turning this place around in record time. Chris followed her down a short hallway and into the lobby of the country club. Doing my best, Sam replied. Ready to grab a sandwich? He nodded. It had been a while since he had that muffin with Miss Doris. Thanks again for recommending Miss Doris's cottage, he said. I wasn't sure about this vacation at first, but you're right. The change of scenery is just what I needed. She's a doll, isn't she? Sam waved at the hostess and pointed at one of the booths next to the large windows overlooking part of the course and a large pond. She is. She brought me muffins this morning. Chris looked a little closer at the pond. Are those kayaks and paddleboards? He asked, unable to keep the surprise from creeping into his voice. They are. Jason's idea. He's big into all that outdoor stuff. He's got me fishing and hiking. We even started going camping. Can you believe it? He couldn't, and told her so. The things you do for love, she said. Oh, there he is. Jason, she called to a young man walking into the restaurant. Jason McKenna, Sam's husband, introduced himself and held out a hand. Chris stood and shook it. Chris Maxwell. It's good to finally meet you. Sam's been telling me a lot about you. Why don't you join us for lunch? Sam asked. I wish I could. I'm in the middle of planting the area behind the fifth hole with Tom. I stopped in to grab some sodas and sandwiches. We're going to try to finish up before the storms roll in this afternoon. Jason looked at his hands. Chris followed his gaze. They were somewhat clean, but there was dirt stuck under Jason's fingernails. It was nice to meet you, Chris. Sorry, I can't stick around. Maybe you can join us for dinner one night while you're down here? Jason asked. Chris assured him he would, and Sam's husband left. He seems like a good guy. He is. Sam couldn't keep her eyes off her husband, who was standing by the door to the kitchen, grabbing a bag with what Chris assumed was the food he'd come to pick up. Jason waved at the two of them on his way out. I'm impressed with what you've done to the place already, Chris said. You look happy. Marriage suits you. Thanks. I am happy. Listen, there's a reason I asked you out here and bribed you with club sandwiches. What's up? Chris was curious what she had in mind. With Sam, there was no telling. She was always good for a surprise. Our biggest problem is that golf is a dying sport. Millennials don't play, and there are only so many baby boomers we can cater to. I don't want to bank on a dying business model. Events and carbon offsetting only get us so far. Here's what I'm thinking. 20 minutes later, Chris had a pretty good idea of what Sam was planning. He liked her idea of turning the golf course property into a return-to-nature type eco-resort. The main clubhouse would stay, but the golf course itself would be returned to a more natural state. The kayaks are a first step in that direction, he asked. Exactly. It will take some time, and it's a huge risk, but I think it would allow us to create a profitable resort business that we can pass on to our kids. Sam scooted to the edge of her chair. Her excitement about the project was palpable. I think it's worth it. Anything you try would be better than continuing to run a golf course that's losing money. He sat back in his chair and took another sip of Coke. His sandwich was long gone, and their waitress had taken his plate while he and Sam had been talking. Great, I'm glad you think so. Sam looked pleased and started to relax a bit herself. How do you like it at Miss Doris's? Done anything fun yet? It's nice. Miss Doris is growing on me. I went with her and her friend Amy to the church to help set up a Christmas display. You should come down. You'd love it. The poinsettia trees, she asked. Chris nodded. I love those, but I'm surprised. I thought the plan was to avoid everything to do with Christmas, she said. It's growing on me. Trying to replace what happened last year with better memories, Chris said. Sam smiled at him. I'm glad and will definitely be down for a service between now and Christmas. Actually, we might come for Christmas, Massachusetts. I haven't been to it in years. My grandparents used to take us. I'd usually fall asleep and Grandpa or Dad would have to carry me back to the car. Sam looked out the window for a moment before returning her gaze to him. Who's Amy? She asked with a knowing glint in her eye. She's a friend of Miss Doris's. The local florist. Chris did his best to look and sound uninterested. Oh, Miss Gardner. She's cute. I picked up my wedding flowers at her shop. Did you ask her out? Sam looked at him expectantly. We went to lunch after putting up the trees. Does that count? Chris enjoyed teasing her a little for giving him a hard time about his love life. She'd been badgering him to get back in the game for months. You tell me. Was Miss Doris there? Sam kept up her interrogation. No, it was just the two of us. Miss Doris had to go help a neighbor. It was nice, but I'm not sure I would call it a date, Chris admitted. Have you thought about asking her to go to dinner? It would be good for you to start getting out there again. Sam was tapping her fingers on the table. I've thought about it, but I'm not ready yet. Chris looked at his friend, hoping she would get the message and drop the topic. He wasn't so lucky. I get that you're scared and feel you need more time, but sometimes the best thing to do is to face those fears. You know, the whole thing about getting back on the horse and all that. The finger tapping had stopped. Sam reached her hand across the table and grabbed his encouragingly. I'm not saying I'm not tempted. I like her. She's nice, and it's easy to talk to her. I don't think it would be fair to either of us right now for me to start dating. I finally feel like I'm getting over Julia. I don't think I'm ready to open myself up that way yet. Do you think Amy is setting you up? Asking you to marry her and planning to run off with your best friend after draining your bank account and asking for half of everything you own in the divorce? Sam was blunt. It wasn't easy to hear, but Chris knew his friend had a point. I don't, but how can I be sure? He asked. You can never be 100% sure. That's the risk you have to take. I don't think it's a risk I'm ready to take, yet, he said. What you're saying is that you're a chicken. She sounds nothing like Julia. Sam shot him a challenging look. He just shook his head. There was no sense in responding to her. Tell you what, she said. You know I'm great at judging character. Let me spend some time with Amy and then you can decide if it's something you want to pursue or not. I don't know about all that, he said. He took a moment to think about it. Having Sam meet Amy wasn't the worst idea. Sam was good at judging people. If she gave him the green light, he could think about spending more time with Amy. Okay, he said. Let me figure something out and call you. Chapter 4. Amy sighed. There was a reason she'd avoided looking too closely at the bookkeeping software these past few weeks. She couldn't afford to keep her blinders on any longer. It was time to face the music. She ran the report and got up to get another cup of coffee while the ancient software her CPA preferred did its thing. A few minutes later it was ready, and as Amy had feared, it didn't look good. Her shop was losing money. Not a lot, but it had been a trend she'd seen for months. Unless some sort of miracle happened, she'd be forced to let Chloe go right after Christmas. Even so, it might not be enough. With the rent increase Mr. Leonard had demanded, she would have to find a way to drum up more business, or risk having to shut down her little shop. Amy downed her coffee and shut down the computer. There wasn't much she could do right now. And there was no way she was firing Chloe before Christmas. Amy wondered if she should tell her friend about the trouble the shop was in, and the strong possibility that Chloe would lose her job by the first of the year. She was torn. It wasn't like Chloe could go out and find something permanent somewhere else until January. Any job openings now would be seasonal work at best. And it would ruin her Christmas. Amy decided to wait, for now. I'm heading out, Chloe. Thanks for watching, Duke. Amy grabbed her purse and went out through the back. By the time Amy arrived at Miss Doris's house, she hadn't made up her mind about what to do long term. She was feeling depressed and angry at herself. What kind of florist and businesswoman was she if she couldn't make enough sales to continue to pay a single employee? Miss Doris waited until Amy was seated at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee and a slice of lemon pound cake in front of her. What's wrong, honey? You look like you haven't slept in days. It's the shop. Mr. Leonard won't agree to any of the repairs. He stopped by the other day to tell me as much, and to let me know that he's raising the rent. Again? Miss Doris got up to cut a slice of cake for herself. How greedy can one man be? Isn't there something you can do? Complain to the council? Amy watched her friend sit back down in the chair across from her. I tried that. It's what prompted the visit and the latest rent increase. He has friends on the council. No one will step up and say or do anything. If I want the awning fixed before it falls on someone, I have to do it myself. And frankly, I can't afford to. Unless business picks up significantly, I'm going to have to let Chloe go after Christmas. Her shoulders slumped, and the last bite of cake got stuck in her throat. Amy washed it down with a big gulp of coffee. I'm so sorry, Amy. Amy could hear the compassion in Miss Doris's voice. It enveloped her like a warm hug. To her surprise, talking to her friend had helped. She was starting to feel a bit better, like part of the burden had been lifted by sharing it. There has to be something we can do about Mr. Leonard. If he did his job as landlord, and if the rent wasn't ridiculously high, the shop would make plenty for the two of you. Am I right? Miss Doris looked right at Amy. Amy nodded. It would. Business is pretty good. The income isn't the issue, it's the expenses, she said. Could you find a different location and move? Miss Doris asked. I might have to. It would add to the expenses short term, but that might be my only choice. I'd hate to leave the building though. It is such a good location. Plenty of foot traffic, and all my customers know where to find me. Amy took a deep breath. It felt good to admit out loud that she might have to move. The thought still scared her, and she wasn't sure she'd find a new place and survive the cost of a move. At least it was something she could do, something that might give her little shop a fighting chance. Mr. Leonard had made it more than obvious that he wanted her out. She shook her head to clear it before looking back up at her friend. Enough about me. I'm not here to pour all my worries out on you. We have a parade to plan." Miss Doris got up and gave Amy a hug. "Don't you ever worry about that," she said. "That's what friends are for." She walked over to the kitchen counter and pulled a large binder out of one of the drawers. She returned and put it on the table in between herself and Amy. "Let's see where we're at." The binder was a treasure trove of checklists and information. There were photos of floats from years past, lists of businesses who had sponsored the event before, as well as one with new contacts Miss Doris wanted to reach out to this year. It even included a map with the route for the parade, and detailed notes on the church parking lot where everyone would line up. They went through quite a bit of the information in the binder together. Amy pulled her own planner out of her purse and started making notes on what she would need to do in the coming days. They were busy studying the route map when Amy heard a knock on the back door. Miss Doris's head rose. "I wonder who that could be." Miss Doris got up and walked down the hall and into the living room. A moment later she returned to the kitchen, Chris Maxwell following close behind her. "Hard at work, I see," Chris said before smiling at Amy. Her stomach did little flips at the sight of his face. What was it about this guy? She couldn't stop thinking about him, and got butterflies any time she saw him. "Coffee?" Miss Doris asked. Without waiting for an answer, she poured him a cup and cut him off a slice of the cake. She placed both on the table and motioned for him to sit. "We're still planning the Christmas parade." "Tell me about it," Chris said, raising the coffee cup to his mouth. Amy was surprised. At their first meeting, he seemed to dislike anything to do with Christmas, but then he'd come and help them set up the display at the church. She wondered what it was about him and the holidays. Amy listened to Miss Doris give Chris a quick rundown of what they'd done so far, and what they planned to accomplish this week. "I think that about sums it up. With all of Amy's help, we're actually ahead for a change." Miss Doris smiled at her friend and then picked up and closed the parade planning binder. She turned to Chris. "Any fun plans for today?" she asked him. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I was thinking of grabbing some lunch. Would the two of you care to join me?" "My treat." Chris was looking right at Amy with a hopeful look in his eyes that sent the butterflies in her stomach fluttering even more than they had before. "Lunch sounds nice," she blurted before she could start to overthink and back out. "You two go ahead. I have a few errands to run for Sarah this afternoon," Miss Doris said before walking to the counter to put the binder away. "Are you ready now, or would you like me to pick you up in a little while?" Chris asked. "Chloe is at the shop. I'll give her a call from the road," Amy said. She got out of her chair and grabbed her keys. "I just need to run to the car to get my purse. I'll be right back." "I'll meet you out front," Chris said. "Poor girl," she heard Miss Doris say as she walked toward the front door. Amy slowed her steps to hear what else her friend would share. "I just hate all the trouble she's going through with her shop." "What do you mean? What's wrong?" Chris asked, and even from the distance, Amy could hear the concern in his voice. She didn't need to hear any more. Suddenly, she regretted her decision to go to lunch with Chris. Successful and rich businessman Chris, who was about to find out what a failure she was when it came to running her own. Amy toyed with the idea of getting in her car and driving off, but her father had raised her better than to run out like that. She'd have to put on her big girl pants and get through the next few hours. She grabbed her purse from the floorboard and locked her car. By the time she walked back, her friends were standing on the back porch. Amy expected looks of pity from either or both of them, but couldn't find a hint of it on their faces. The two of them said their goodbyes to Miss Doris and walked to Chris's car. "I have a friend up in Myrtle Beach who runs a golf course with her husband. I thought maybe we could have lunch there," Chris said, holding the car door open for her. "That sounds like fun." Amy did her best to stay upbeat. She could see him typing away on his phone as he walked around to the driver's side. She assumed he was giving his friend a heads up. "Are you sure she won't mind us dropping by?" Amy asked after he got into the car. The phone beeped and Chris glanced down at it. She is looking forward to meeting you. He smiled and started the car. I like her, Sam said when Amy left to use the restroom. I think that's my cue to leave. Jason rose and shook Chris's hand. For what it's worth, I think she's a nice girl. He turned to his wife. I'm heading out to talk to Brandon about native plants. I'll be back before dinner. Sam nodded, and he bent down to kiss her goodbye. Good seeing you again, Chris. I hope we can meet up for dinner before you leave. Maybe we'll make it a double date. He winked before sauntering off. I'm serious. I like her, and I'm not getting any weird vibes from her. Unlike Julia. Chris could read the subtext of the conversation, and he was glad Sam approved of Amy. He nodded and ate the last bit of his club sandwich. It had been just as good as the first one. I'm glad you asked her out today. Sam looked at him, the question obvious in her eyes. I know what you're asking. I'm not sure, but I'm not totally opposed to the idea of dating anymore, Chris said. Good. That's all I'm asking. Sam smiled at him. Here she comes. Chris turned and watched Amy walk back to their table. He did like her, quite a lot. She was cute with her shoulder-length blonde hair and those pretty brown eyes. He wished she didn't cast them down as often as she did. Amy was a shy person, especially around people she didn't know. He was glad that she'd warmed up around Sam and Jason over lunch. This place is beautiful, Amy said as she returned to her seat. It would make a great wedding venue. Sam nodded. It is. We have started doing quite a bit of that lately. I work with a few different wedding planners in town. Which reminds me. Chris mentioned that you own a flower shop. Do you do wedding arrangements? Amy nodded. It's about half my business. How would you feel about delivering up here? Sam asked. I could do that. It's less than an hour drive from my shop on Palmar Island. Judging from the smile on her face, Amy had a pretty good idea of where this was going. Chris knew he could count on his friend to help the girl out. He had privately shared a little of what he knew about Amy's troubles to Sam when they first arrived at Willow Run. Do you have a card on you? I'd love to send a little extra wedding business your way. Do you do flowers for other events as well? Sam looked as excited as Amy. Chris leaned back in his chair and listened to the two girls chatter about various types of flowers and different styles of bouquets. It was a foreign language to him, but by the looks of it, a new collaboration was in the works. A few minutes later, Sam rose, after she had asked Amy to deliver weekly flower arrangements for the country club. This, combined with orders for special events, should bring quite a bit of extra business to the happy florist. Chris hoped it would be enough to turn things around for Amy. I'm sorry you guys, but I have to run. I'm expecting a couple of phone calls, Sam said. Chris stood up as well and hugged his friend. Thanks for doing that, he whispered in her ear. Sam squeezed him a little tighter in response before letting him go. It was very nice to meet you. I hope we get to see more of you soon, Sam said to Amy. The both of you. That would be nice. Amy and Sam exchanged a brief hug as well. Why don't you guys try out the paddleboards before you leave? Sam suggested. Chris saw Amy's face light up with excitement. That's a great idea, he said. He noticed Amy look down at her skirt and boots. I'm not really dressed for it. Her face fell. Maybe another time? Sam looked Amy up and down and then smiled. That's not a problem. We have wetsuits for rent at the pro shop. I'm sure we can find something in your size. Let me walk you up there. It's on the way to my office anyway. Chris pulled out his wallet to pay for lunch. Sam put a hand on his arm. This one's on me. Let's go. 30 minutes later, Chris and Amy were dressed in wetsuits and standing on paddleboards. At least they were trying. The suits had been a good idea. Both of them had already taken a plunge into the chilly water of the small golf course lake. It really was more of a lake than a pond, Chris decided. This is a little harder than it looks, Amy sputtered as she lifted herself back onto her board. You can say that again. Chris wobbled for a moment on his board, but caught himself. Slowly but surely, he was starting to get the hang of this. The two of them spent the next hour paddling close to the shore of the lake, gaining skills and confidence as they went along. It was hard to get close enough to each other to talk without risking running into her, but it was fun watching Amy grow more bold. She was starting to come out of her shell out on the water. He filed that little bit of info for later, and vowed to get her outside in nature more often. The thought made him stop in his tracks, and he almost took another dip in the frigid lake. Thanks for introducing me to Sam, Amy said on the ride back to Palmar Island. Those new contracts are just what I need. I may not have to let Chloe go after all. She couldn't express how grateful she was and how much of a burden had lifted with the prospect of regular new orders. I didn't realize it had gotten that bad. Miss Doris told me about the rent increase, but I didn't know you'd considered downsizing. She looked over at Chris to see what he thought about her small business troubles. Amy had picked up from the conversation at lunch that the software business Chris was running was extremely successful. She assumed it was where he'd made his billions. Her own shop was small peanuts compared to the empire he'd built. She hoped he didn't think her a complete and utter failure, because that's what she'd been feeling like these past few weeks. Her shop was her pride and joy, and a huge part of her life. Chris was looking at the road in front of him. From what she could tell, he looked concerned, but not disappointed. Encouraged by her impression of him, she decided to share a little of what had been going on the past few months. Maybe he could provide some insight and show her a way out of the financial mess she was getting herself into. The shop's been quite profitable until the new owner took over. My profit margins aren't huge, and I'd hate to raise prices to the point where my regulars can't afford me. I hired Chloe just before the sale of the building. Between adding an employee and the 2 rent increases since July, my expenses have skyrocketed. I'm struggling to bump up the income to make up for it. This should help though. Amy didn't want him to think she was ungrateful for his help with Sam. He raised the rent on you twice? In 6 months? Chris glanced over at her as if to confirm he heard her right. Yes. That's ridiculous. Miss Doris mentioned he's not taking care of the building either. Have you tried talking to someone on city council? Maybe they can apply some pressure to at least get him to fix that awning. That thing is a safety hazard. Chris's voice kept getting louder and louder as he ranted on. Tried that. The council is in Mr. Leonard's pocket. Of course they are. Chris slammed his hands on the steering wheel. I'll talk to a lawyer buddy of mine and see if there's any legal action you could take. That's not necessary, Amy said. Really, she continued when she saw him glance at her disbelievingly. You've done so much already. I'm sure I can save up the money to replace the awning by spring. And if all else fails, I'll find a different location for the shop. The thought didn't seem as horrible as it had a few days ago. That's always an option. It's a great location though. I didn't realize you'd been by, Amy said. I was grabbing lunch and saw the shop. I peeked in. You were busy. Kai shrugged. Amy decided it was time to change the topic. They chatted about their visit with Sam and the paddleboarding experience the rest of the way home. Next time, let's try kayaking. There are supposed to be some fun excursions through the marsh and along the intercoastal waterway, Chris said as he pulled up to Miss Doris's house. Before Amy could reply, he was out of the car and walking around to open her door. Come on in. It's open, they heard Miss Doris call when they rang the doorbell. Amy tried turning the handle, and sure enough, the front door was unlocked. Alarm bells went off in the back of her head. Miss Doris never left her door unlocked. Like any tourist town filled with homes that stood empty for part of the year, the area had seen the occasional break-ins. No one Amy knew took any chances, and kept their windows and doors locked. She rushed in to check on her friend. What's wrong? Amy asked when she found the elderly woman lying on the couch, a crocheted blanket covering her. "Are you sick?" Miss Doris had seemed fine when they left this morning. Amy turned around to look at Chris for reassurance. He was pulling his phone out of the pocket of the khakis he was wearing today. "Would you like me to call your doctor?" he asked. "Not necessary," Miss Doris said. She tried to scoot up to a sitting position, let out a small moan, and lowered herself back down. "It's my back. I threw it out again," she said. "I'm fine, really. Sarah was here to help me to the couch before she left to meet Ryan. I have my heating pad and plenty of Motrin." She motioned to a small bottle of pills and a glass of water sitting in easy reach on the side table. "When will Sarah be back?" Amy asked. "In an hour or so. No need for you to worry. I'll be fine. It will just take me a few days to get back on my feet, which means I need you to take the lead on the parade stuff." Miss Doris looked up at Amy. Amy could feel her hands getting clammy. She rubbed them on her skirt and cleared her throat. "You can do this, Amy," Miss Doris said with all the confidence in the world in her voice. Amy saw her friend turn toward Chris. "You'll help her, won't you?" she asked. "Of course. Whatever you need." "What's our next step?" Amy was surprised how quickly he agreed to help. She still wasn't so sure about all this, especially as she listened to Miss Doris tell Chris about visiting business owners and other prominent figures in the community to ask them about sponsorship and participation. "You two will do fine. Most of them have been part of the parade for years. It'll be an easy sell," Miss Doris reassured them. Not that Chris looked like he needed much reassuring. He seemed excited and ready to take on the challenge. Amy was glad she had him on her side. "This will give me a chance to get to know your town a little better." Chris smiled at Amy, and she got the feeling she was missing some important subtext in the statement. "I'm so sorry about dumping this on you, Amy," Miss Doris said. "I know you have plenty of other things to worry about right now with the shop." Amy waved her away. "Don't worry about it," she said, hoping her friend would drop the topic. She wasn't in the mood to talk about the trouble her business was in again. "We'll take care of it. The main thing right now is to make sure everyone is on board, and get them started on planning their floats. You should probably stop by to see Chief Townsend and make sure he's briefed on everything." Miss Doris turned to Chris to explain. "He's our chief of police. He has to approve the parade route even though it's the same one every single year." She sighed. "Makes him feel like he's important, I guess. You should see how many police cars he'll have along the way, making sure every intersection is secure, even though the whole town will be right there watching the parade." She rolled her eyes. Amy didn't think she'd ever seen Miss Doris do that. She had to suppress a giggle. "There's a lot more to organizing this parade than I realized." "The two of you do this every year?" Chris asked. "By yourselves?" Amy and Miss Doris nodded. "Okay." Chris rolled up his sleeves, and suddenly Amy could picture him in a boardroom, running a meeting for his company. "We've got this. I assume we can take your binder with us?" Miss Doris nodded. He turned to Amy. "Why don't we meet for breakfast tomorrow morning? I'll go over the contents of the binder tonight and make a preliminary list." "I can help you with that," Miss Doris said. He nodded, a grateful smile on his face. "Perfect. Miss Doris and I will make the list tonight, and I'll meet you at the bakery down by your shop, and we can finalize our plans." "How does 9:30 sound?" "That works." It would give Amy a chance to walk Duke and check in on the shop before spending much of the day on parade duty. She hoped Chloe wouldn't mind manning it by herself for another day. At least the orders for flower arrangements wouldn't pick up until later in the week. Amy said her goodbyes and drove straight to the store. It was surprisingly busy when she got there. Chloe and Amy worked side by side, helping customers, and putting together fresh bouquets until it was time to close up shop. "It wasn't like this all day, was it?" Amy asked after she flipped the sign from open to closed and locked the front door. No, not until a minute before you got here. I would have called you to come in otherwise. Chloe was finishing sweeping the floors. There was a steady flow of customers all day long, but nothing like this last little rush. Should make for a profitable day. Amy nodded, she could use one of those. Thanks for watching Duke for me. I didn't plan on being gone so long, Amy said as the women settled in on the wooden bench out back. She handed Chloe one of the cheerwine sodas she kept tucked in the back of the fridge, which was mainly used to store some of the more delicate flowers. It's no problem. I let him out for a little while at lunch to run around and do his business. He was very well behaved and slept most of the day in your chair. Chloe grabbed the bottle and took a sip of the bright red soda. Amy wasn't surprised. She'd taken the young beagle for a long walk this morning before dropping him off at the shop. How was the date? Chloe asked a few minutes later. The sun was starting to set behind the buildings across the street. Amy wished she'd brought her sunglasses, and not just to protect herself against the last few rays of the sun. She could feel her friend's eyes probing her at the loaded question. It wasn't it, she stopped herself and almost laughed at the incredulous look Chloe shot her. Okay, it was a date. It was nice. I met his friends Sam and Jason. He made you hang out with his guy friends? Chloe put her soda down and faced Amy. No, Sam. Samantha is one of his best friends from college. She and her husband are running the Willow Run Golf Course and Country Club. I like her. Amy looked up and over Chloe's shoulder to check on Duke. He was starting to wander a little too far. She whistled, and he rushed back. Amy patted her dog's head. Good boy. You can keep playing, but stay close. The dog blinked and wandered off to sniff another rock. Sam might send a good bit of business our way. We're going to do their weekly flower arrangements for the club. We might even get some extra wedding orders out of it. Chloe grinned, the excitement showing on her face. That's great news. She picked up her empty bottle. This calls for another round of cheerwine. Amy laughed and handed Chloe her own empty soda bottle. This day did deserve an extra dose of the cherry-flavored soft drink. Do you think you'd be okay by yourself in the shop for a few more hours tomorrow morning? Amy asked her friend when she returned. Of course. It's usually quiet on Wednesday mornings anyway. What's up? Another fun date? Most people do these in the evenings, you know? Amy almost spat out her soda at her friend's deadpan remark. It's not a, she saw Chloe roll her eyes. I'm serious. This time it really isn't a date. Miss Doris hurt her back, and Chris has offered to come with me to talk to some of the shop owners and the sheriff about the parade. That's nice of him, Chloe said, relaxing back into the bench. He's taking an interest and getting to know people in the community. Maybe he'll stick around past Christmas. I wouldn't count on that. Wait until he realizes how much work this parade really is. He might go running for the hills, Amy shot back. Always the pessimist, Chloe said and shook her head. He might stay. Who knows, he might like it so much down here that he relocates. She wriggled her eyebrows suggestively at Amy. I doubt that. His family and his business are in Colorado. It was important for her to remember that. He wasn't planning on sticking around. People never did. She knew that from first-hand experience. He might surprise you. Chloe's voice softened. Her friend was picking up on the direction her thoughts were taking. Not everyone leaves. Chapter 5. What's up? Sam asked. Chris was grateful his friend had picked up the phone. He needed her advice. Sam had always had the better people skills, and she'd spent a lot of time in the small island community. I'm helping Amy and Miss Doris with the Christmas parade. He could hear Sam laugh at the other end of the line. Of course you are. What can I do for you? Want us to sponsor a float? Sure, that would be great. I'll put you guys down for one and email you the route and schedule later tonight. That's not why I called, though. He put the binder he'd borrowed from Miss Doris on the coffee table and stretched out on the couch. Why did you call then? Sam asked. I was hoping you could give me some pointers on handling the locals. I'm supposed to make the rounds with Amy in the morning, and we're both brand new at this. Chris hated how unsure of himself he sounded. Let me think. He could hear Sam tap her fingernails on a desk or table, a habit he remembered from their study group days in college. I think your best bet would be to get in touch with Walt Marcus. He goes by Walt Jr. and practices family law. He has dealt with all of my family's legal stuff down here. I'll give him a call and let him know you're coming. It's Marcus and Son Family Law. They are right on Main Street. Chris thought he remembered seeing a law office when he walked over to check out Amy's shop a few days ago. That's a good suggestion. Thank you. Walt Jr. can introduce you to some of the others. His family has been here for generations. He knows everyone. That will make my life so much easier. I met a few people helping out at church, but I don't have any real contacts down here yet. Yet? Of course Sam would pick up on that word. That's an interesting development. So you're thinking about putting down roots on the island? It wouldn't have anything to do with Amy, would it? She teased. We'll see where this goes. I like her, but it's not like I'm ready to propose or anything. He could hear Sam laugh again. I'm just happy you're finally admitting you like her, Sam said. What do you mean finally? I've only known her for a little over a week. You have a point there, Sam admitted. I just want to see you happy. I know that. Hey, thanks for sending some extra business Amy's way. It might just be what keeps her from closing the doors to her shop, or at the very least having to move to a different location, Chris said. How so? Someone new bought the building over the summer. A Mr. Leonard. I don't know exactly what's going on, but he sounds like a bit of a slumlord. That's not good. Poor Amy. What are you going to do about it? Sam asked. I don't think there's much I can do. Chris hated to admit it, but with no connections down here and his inquiry with his lawyer friend going nowhere, there wasn't much he could do. Buy the building. It's a good investment. The town is thriving, and you should be getting some pretty decent rent once the building is updated. Is it large enough to use the upstairs to create that retreat space for your company that you've been talking about? Palmar Island wouldn't be a bad place to have it. That's not a bad idea. Chris had been toying with the idea of setting up a satellite office. Somewhere his programmers could come to when they were stuck or needed a change of scenery. He envisioned it as a spot to work, but also as a place to hang out and recharge. Sometimes that was just what his guys needed to break through a coding problem. It could become a part-time office for you, too. I'm sure Amy would love it if you worked from down here most of the time. Sam sounded determined to sell him on the idea. I'm not sure the guy will sell though. He just bought Amy's building and the two on either side of her. I'm sure he has plans, Chris said. Those can change. And what did my daddy always say? You can buy just about anything for the right price. Make him an offer and see how it goes. Chris knew Sam had a point. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea of building the second office here in South Carolina. He'd have to talk to his CFO to see if there were some sort of tax benefits to owning some property in the state. They could hire some locals to man the office, do IT support, and maybe even add a coder from down here to the team. It wouldn't be a huge operation, but maybe the state would throw some tax incentives their way. He rubbed his chin, deep in thought. Keep an ear out while you're making the rounds tomorrow. Sam's voice startled him, and he almost dropped his phone. Maybe there are some rumors floating around about that Leonard guy. I have a feeling there's more to this story, if he's raising rent and refusing to take care of the buildings. Chris agreed. He chatted for a few more minutes with Sam and then got back to work studying the binder Miss Doris had let him borrow. He planned on going in prepared tomorrow. Thank you for your generous donation, Chris heard Amy say before they walked out the door of Klein's seafood market. Not only had Mr. Klein been happy to take on leadership of building one of the floats for the parade, he'd written them a check to offset some of the costs associated with putting the event on. "It's my pleasure, miss," Mr. Klein replied. "Happy to give back to the community, and it's some of the most effective advertising I do all year." Chris didn't doubt it. There would be as many tourists as there were locals standing along the parade route. He wouldn't be surprised if quite a few of them would stop to buy some salmon or a couple of pounds of the famous South Carolina shrimp from the fishmonger. "It's good to meet you, Chris," Mr. Klein called as they walked through the door. Chris waved in response. "You're good at this," Amy said as they walked along Main Street. After meeting her for coffee at the Sweet Treats Bakery, they'd visited Sam's lawyer friend. Walt Marcus Jr. had agreed to introduce them to a few of the other small business owners in the area. Mr. Klein had been the last of them, before Walt Jr. had to head back to the office. They were supposed to join a few others for lunch at Mary's. Chris appreciated the effort Walt Jr. went through to help them out, and had told the older gentleman so. "That's just the way folks are around here," was all he had replied. The more time Chris spent on Palmar Island, getting to know the locals, the more he liked it. He could see himself working a big part of the year from here, and thought his team would enjoy the location as well. Having Amy by his side all morning didn't hurt either. It was helping warm him up to the idea. "This has been fun. We've met with an interesting group of people already," Chris said. "I can't wait to see who shows up for lunch." Walt Jr. had made a few calls while they were walking up and down Main Street this morning. "This has been a lot easier than I thought. I can't believe how many parade participants we've gotten so far." Amy had a little extra spring in her step as they walked back to her shop to check on Chloe and Duke. "At this rate, we'll have the whole thing organized in a couple of days. Miss Doris is going to be so happy." Chris nodded. She would be. He had dropped in on his landlady before he'd left this morning, and she'd seemed to be getting better. He could have sworn he had seen her walk out to the mailbox when he first woke up. He had asked, but the older woman flat out denied it. He wouldn't call her a liar, but he was wondering if the back issue was a ruse to get him and Amy to spend more time together. Not that he minded. Miss Doris did seem to be concerned about the parade, and had left him with a long list of instructions about how to deal with each prominent member of the community. Between her advice and Walt Jr.'s introductions, the errand had been a piece of cake so far. What Chris liked best about today was that no one was looking at him with pity in their eyes because his fiancée had left him for his best friend. In Denver, and in his small hometown of Frisco in the Colorado Rockies, he couldn't set a foot out without someone giving him the look. Few people outside his immediate family knew the full story, but there had been no way to hide the fact that his high society wedding had been cancelled, and that his bride and one of his best friends, the guy who was supposed to be his best man, had left town. It hadn't taken long for the rumors to start flying. "Any news from your parents?" Amy asked. It startled Chris, and for a moment he thought she read the thoughts on his face. He'd been thinking about how hard the first few weeks had been for his mom. It was one of the reasons he'd arranged for a series of trips to get the two of them out of Colorado. The world cruise had been the latest. "They are good. I talked to them yesterday. They are in Egypt, and couldn't stop talking about how amazing the monuments and museums are. Almost makes me want to go." He smiled as he thought back on their conversation. His mom had been so excited. He'd told both his parents about Palmar Island. He thought they'd both like it down here. His dad had complained about the snow they were getting in their part of the Rockies for years. Maybe moving to Palmar Island, even if it was part-time, could work out for everyone involved. His mom would adore a house on the beach. "Do you travel much?" Amy readjusted the strap of her purse before it slid off her shoulder. "Mostly for business. I've been all over the place in the US, and of course Japan. Last year I spent a good bit of time in Romania." He almost laughed at the confused look on her face. "There are a lot of good programmers in Romania." My COO wanted to see if it would be worth outsourcing to a group of young guys over there. It didn't work out. He shrugged. Beautiful country though. How about you? I've barely been out of the Southeast. I grew up just outside of Atlanta and moved down here. She hesitated. I moved down here after my father passed away. There was nothing left for me in Georgia. Chris had to resist the urge to hug her. She looked so sad and lost. If you could travel anywhere in the world, where would it be? He asked to distract her. Paris. The answer came quickly and without hesitation. Interesting. He'd make sure to remember this for future reference. What about something like this? Chris pushed his empty plate to the side and reached for Amy's pen. Then he quickly sketched his idea for the float onto his napkin. It wouldn't take more than a couple of sheets of plywood and some paint. You can put some chairs here. Any garden chair would work. That's not a bad idea, one of the council members replied. At first, the lot of them had sounded like they'd rather bow out of taking part in the parade this year. Chris hoped Mr. Leonard didn't have his hand in making that particular decision. Chris had spent the last hour convincing the council and every other prominent member of the Palmar Island community to participate in the parade. Amy had collected quite a few donations, and Chris wasn't going to let the men and women gathered around Mary's largest table leave before they were each assigned to a float, and had a solid idea of how they would build it. He pushed the finished drawing to the small group of city councilmen and sat back. His glance roamed over the table and he took in the excited chatter. Amy leaned over to him. You are very good at this, she whispered softly. He smiled. It hadn't been any harder than managing his team of programmers when they found themselves stuck and ready to quit the development of a difficult app. What surprised him was how much he was enjoying himself. Coming up with ideas for the floats had him all excited and itching to try his hands at building one of his own. How would you feel about adding one more float? He asked Amy. We could build one of our own. Do you think Miss Doris would enjoy riding in the parade? Last night, Chris had been surprised to learn from the older woman that she'd organized the parade for well over a decade, but had yet to ride on a float of her own. Amy looked a little hesitant. I don't know. Do we have time to do that with everything else going on? It wouldn't have to be anything complicated or involved, Chris assured her. He noticed the conversations around him dying down. I think it's a wonderful idea. Miss Doris would love it, and she deserves a spot in the parade. Doug Chaplin, the owner of the largest insurance agency in town, reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. I'll sponsor your float. He quickly made out a check and handed it to Amy. This should get you started. Call me if you need more. Chris watched Amy's eyes get wide when she glanced at the check. Thank you, she mumbled before tucking it into the envelope which held the rest of the checks they'd collected so far today. Y'all can have one of my trailers, Jim Falcon, who owned Falcon Ford, declared from across the table. We'll come help you put it together, Ms. Dewey said. Her sister and best friend, who ran the local hair salon with her, agreed. We'll bring Matt, for the heavy lifting. Chris wondered if this was the same Matt that had helped them put together the tree display at church. It's a wonderful idea, the Reverend agreed. Miss Doris is going to love it. Don't you agree, Amy? He asked. Chris looked over and saw Amy nod, a big smile on her face. It tugged at his heart to see her this happy and excited. Should we keep it a secret? She asked. Surprise her on the day of the parade? Big nods came from everyone around the table. It's going to be hard not to let anything slip, Amy said as they rode back to the beach house. Chris and she had promised to report back to Miss Doris on how they had fared today. Amy held a small takeout box with a large slice of peanut butter pie in her lap. Sarah answered the door and let them in. She's in the kitchen, she said before heading back upstairs. They found Miss Doris standing at the sink doing dishes. Oh, there you are? How did it go? She asked while rinsing and drying her hands. She shuffled to the kitchen table and sat down with a loud groan. Chris still wasn't buying the backache, but decided to play along. It went well, Amy said. Chris was amazing. She shot him a look so filled with gratitude, he could feel himself grow taller. He couldn't have suppressed the grin on his face if he'd tried. The entire council is on board, and you're not going to believe how many donations we got. Chris listened to Amy happily chatting away, recounting everything they'd done that day. I brought you back some pie, she told Miss Doris. Do you want it here, or would you be more comfortable in the living room? She opened the container and moved the peanut butter pie to a small plate, then pulled a fork out of one of the kitchen drawers and handed the pie to Miss Doris. You're so sweet. Here is fine. Miss Doris took a bite. She put her fork down and rose from her chair. How about a cup of coffee, she asked before walking back to the counter and getting busy fixing a pot. Chris shot Amy a knowing glance. There was nothing wrong with the older woman's back. Chapter 6. I can't believe you've talked me into this. I haven't baked since I was in elementary school. Chris looked adorable in the blue apron she'd handed him when they started pulling out ingredients for the cookie dough. It had a few ruffles at the bottom, but was by far the manliest apron she owned. Amy liked aprons, and had acquired quite the collection over the years. Not only were they great at keeping your clothes clean while cooking or working in the flower shop, but all of hers had handy pockets to hold everything she needed to carry around. The skirts and dress pants she usually wore hardly ever included pockets, and even those in her jeans were too small to hold much of anything. Wearing aprons whenever she was cooking or doing anything around the house was her solution to the pocket problem. You have got to be kidding. That can't be true. She pretended to be shocked. You didn't help your mom make cookies? Chris shook his head. I'm good at eating them though. He grinned. I bet, Amy shot back. She loved how easy it was to be around him now that they had gotten to know each other a little better. She couldn't remember ever being this comfortable around another man her age, other than Adam. She missed Adam, but Amy wasn't going to let that ruin her day. She had cookies to bake. Tell me again why you volunteered to make 10 dozen decorated cookies? 10 dozen. Chris shook his head while measuring and sifting 10 cups of flour into one of her largest bowls. You realize that's 120 cookies. Actually, I promised them bakers dozens, so 130 cookies. She laughed as Chris groaned. It'll be fun. I promise. Amy pulled out the large mixer from the cabinet below the counter and dumped an insane amount of butter into the stainless steel bowl. This is going to be loud, she warned Chris before turning it on to cream the butter. She briefly contemplated making the sugar cookie dough in 2 batches, but decided to go for it. There was a reason she owned the biggest and strongest mixer available for personal use. Plus, if they got done with the cookies early enough, she could make a batch of her famous homemade dog treats as well. The pups at the animal rescue would love those. Tell me about this fundraiser, Chris said as he continued to sift cup after cup of flour, using her grandmother's old metal sifter. It was one of those old-fashioned contraptions with a small arm on the side that you turned to move the flour through the sift in the bottom of the cup. It's for the shelter here on the island, where I got Duke. They get a lot of abandoned pets at the first of the year. She started to pour the sugar into the creamed butter mixture, 1 cup at a time, pausing in between to scrape the sides of the bowl with her favorite spatula. Why so many this time of the year? Chris asked. People get pets for Christmas, and then a few weeks later, they realize how much work they really are. She looked over and saw him nod. The funds from this weekend's bake sale will help with that, of course, and it will be a good time to educate and discourage people from buying or adopting a pet without doing their homework first. The real reason for the event is to raise funds for a new dog park. Pat and Jamie, the couple who run the shelter, own the empty lot next to it. The idea is to have a park where people can come and meet dogs who are waiting for their forever home. That's a great idea, Chris yelled over the sound of the mixer she'd turned back on. She poured the last cup of sugar in and let it mix while she grabbed the eggs from the fridge. She lowered the speed of the mixer, which quieted things down in her kitchen, before she continued her train of thought. I like giving back. They were good to Duke, and very helpful when I first got him. I've been volunteering there ever since. Not as much as I'd like to, but I do what I can. Amy enjoyed her time at the shelter and often brought Duke back to hang out with some of the friendlier dogs. All done, Chris said and spun around to put away the sifter. His elbow caught on the edge of the bowl and flour went everywhere. It looked like a blizzard exploded in her kitchen. Amy blinked and started laughing. Tears were streaming from her eyes and she had to hold her stomach to keep it from hurting too much. Chris hesitated for a moment and then joined in. "I'm so sorry," he blurted out a few moments later after they'd both started to compose themselves. Duke padded up and stuck his head into the kitchen. "Oh no, you don't," Amy said before quickly shutting the door. She did not need him covered in flour too. She handed Chris a broom and grabbed a couple of rags from her cleaning supply closet. Between the two of them they had the mess cleaned up in no time. "I'll run out and grab some more flour," Chris offered after tossing the almost empty bag he'd used into the trash. "No need," Amy said and bent down, glad she'd been prepared for a baking emergency like this. She grabbed a brand new 5-pound bag of all-purpose flour and set it on the counter. Amy checked the creamed butter and sugar. It looked fine and she got busy adding eggs, one at a time, to the mixture. As soon as Chris had measured and sifted the second batch of flour and carefully handed her the bowl, Amy added it slowly to the mixer. It didn't take long for the cookie dough to form. "This smells great already," Chris commented, taking a careful peek into the bowl. "We're all set," Amy said after she finished wrapping the second ball of dough in plastic wrap and set it into the fridge. "Ready for a break while the dough chills?" "That's a thing?" Chris looked incredulous. "Of course it's a thing. You have to let the cookie dough cool for at least an hour before you try to roll it out. Otherwise, it's too soft to handle." She closed the door to her fridge and went to the sink to wash the sticky remnants of dough from her hands. "I had no idea. Remember, it's been a while since I made this type of cookie. If I had to guess, I'd say I was about 7 or 8. Chris took off his apron and hung it over the back of one of the chairs in her kitchen. The place was small and there was barely room for the bistro table and chairs, but it did have a fair amount of counter space which had come in handy so far in their cookie-making adventure. "There's something you should know," Chris said while they strolled down the sidewalk. "I was engaged all of last year." Amy saw him wringing his hands together. "Her name was Julia. We were supposed to have a Christmas wedding. I found out she was cheating on me and only after my money. It's made it harder for me to trust." He looked at her with a raw openness and honesty that took her breath away. "And it took the joy out of Christmas." He nodded. Amy didn't know what else to say. She squeezed his hand and they walked in companionable silence. By the time they returned from a brisk walk with Duke down to the park at the end of her street and back, the dough was cool enough to roll out and cut with Amy's collection of antique cookie cutters. Amy scattered a bit of flour on the countertop and rolled out the dough. She handed Chris one of the star-shaped cookie cutters. "Start on that end and try to cut them as close together as you can. Let me show you." She picked up a candy cane-shaped cookie cutter and demonstrated how to use it on the other side of the sheet of cookie dough. "Like this?" he asked. She looked up at Chris and nodded her approval before getting the cookie sheets ready and setting the oven to preheat. They worked as a team, cutting and baking cookies for the next hour. "I think we're starting to run out of countertop space," Chris commented when she pulled the last of the cookies from the oven. He wasn't wrong. Every inch of space was covered in cooling racks holding cookies. "We'll have to make some room before we can start to decorate them." Amy carefully removed the sugar cookies from the baking sheet and placed them on her last rack to cool. "I didn't think about that." Chris was slumped down on one of her small bistro chairs. His face was red and she could see a few beads of sweat running down the side of his face. He wiped them off with the corner of the apron he'd put back on after their walk. "It'll be fun." "How about a soda break first?" she asked. "You look like you could use something cold to drink." He nodded. "Coke or cheer wine?" she asked. "What's cheer wine?" A wine cooler? Amy laughed. It's a soda. Cherry flavored. She grabbed 2 tall glasses and filled them with plenty of ice before pouring the bright red soda on top. On a whim, she grabbed some maraschino cherries from the fridge and added 1 to each of their glasses. Try it and see if you like it. She watched him closely as he took a first, cautious sip. Not bad. He took a bigger swig. This is good. Chris grinned at her. Glad you like it. Drink up and we'll start decorating those cookies, Amy said. Yes, ma'am. Amy rolled her eyes at him and walked over to the counter. She finished her soda while stacking the cookies that were cool enough to decorate onto her favorite Christmas plate. She wiped off the counter and set out red, white, green, and light blue icing, along with various sprinkles. Chris walked up next to her. What would you like me to do? He asked. Amy thought for a moment. Why don't you spread some of the blue icing on the stars and then sprinkle some of these on there before it sets? She handed him a small container of snowflake sprinkles. She got to work decorating the Candy King cookies by piping equal stripes of white and red icing on them. A few sprinkles of granulated sugar added a nice finishing touch. Perfect. She loved this part of the Christmas cookie making process the most. Your cookies look much better than mine. Chris sounded frustrated and Amy looked up from her own stack of cookies. That's not too bad, she said. Sure, the icing wasn't applied evenly, and the sprinkles were gathering in small little piles, but they were still cute cookies. Yours just look a little more homemade. That's one way of putting it. I am definitely out of practice. Who knew giving up on decorating Christmas cookies would come back to bite me, he said. My mom is going to love this. I can hear the "I told you so" already. He shook his head and tried to spread some of the sprinkles around. These don't look anything like yours. He looked over at the small pile of cookies Amy had finished decorating. Yours look like they came from a shop, something you'd be proud to offer to your guests. Mine look like a kindergarten art project gone wrong. Amy couldn't believe how hard he was on himself about the cookies. They're sugar cookies. They'll taste just as good and they really don't look that bad. Yeah, right. But who would buy these? Those poor dogs will be so disappointed if they don't get their park. Amy laughed. First of all, they are dogs. They have no idea what's coming. Secondly, your cookies will sell. You just wait and see. She stopped for a moment when she realized she had no idea if he planned on attending the small Christmas craft fair at the shelter tomorrow. She shouldn't assume. I'll bring my checkbook just in case. If all else fails, I'll finance it myself. Those dogs are getting that park. Amy glanced over and saw him nodding to himself. The expression on his face had changed from disappointment to some sort of excited determination. Chris started spreading the icing with more enthusiasm and finished each one with a hearty shake of sprinkles. The end result didn't look much better than his first few attempts, but Amy was glad to see him having fun. You have some frosting there. Amy leaned in and wiped the pale blue paste off his nose. She wondered how in the world he'd gotten it there. He was leaning in, slowly closing the distance between their faces. She could feel his breath wash over her face, the sweet smell of icing enveloping her. He must have snuck a taste, she thought before she felt his lips brush across hers. She glanced up and their eyes locked. She could see tenderness, desire, and maybe a little fear reflect back at her. Amy held her breath, waiting to see what he would do next. His lips returned, pressing more firmly against hers. She could taste the icing now, sweet with just a hint of vanilla. Her eyes drifted shut and all she could think was how nice this felt. Amy lifted her arms and wrapped them around his neck. He was cradling her close, holding her firmly against himself. She sighed through their kiss. She hadn't realized how much she'd craved being held, being close enough to someone, to feel their heartbeat and share their warmth. As far as she was concerned, this kiss could last forever. "Wanna come Christmas shopping with me?" Chloe asked over the phone. "My mom is keeping Toby, and I was thinking of heading up to the outlet shops. Amy was sitting on her bed surrounded by piles of clothes. I can't. I'm in the middle of organizing my closet. What happened? Chloe asked. Her friend knew her all too well. Amy cleaned, organized, and reorganized when her mind was cluttered and her heart was in trouble. It helped her process, and staying busy kept the anxiety at bay. Chris came over last night to help me bake cookies for the fundraiser this afternoon. She tucked the phone between her cheek and shoulder and started folding the pile of t-shirts in front of her. That's sweet of him. So what happened that has you reorganizing your closet on your only day off this week? Chloe wasn't going to let this go. We kissed. Amy laughed when she heard her friend whoop on the other end of the line. About time, girl. Please tell me he's a good kisser. I'm not talking about this, Amy said. No fair. You're the one who brought it up. Chloe sounded disappointed. You know I live for stuff like this. Sorry. Amy wasn't about to gossip about the most exciting and exhilarating thing that had happened to her in months. Just wait until I see you at the shop tomorrow. I'm going to make you spill the beans, Chloe teased before hanging up. Amy smiled and tossed her phone on the pillow. Chloe could try, but it wouldn't do her any good. Her father had raised her better than to kiss and tell. That kiss though. Amy felt hope bubble up inside her heart anytime she thought back on the moment when Chris had leaned in and kissed her. It had turned into a full-body embrace that left them both breathless. She couldn't remember how they'd finished decorating and wrapping the cookies, but they were all stacked up neatly in a large box on her kitchen table, ready to take to the shelter. She and Duke would leave for the event at the shelter in a few hours. Chris was supposed to meet them there. The thought sent the butterflies in her stomach all aflutter. Amy climbed off the bed and started sorting through a stack of skirts. She needed to move, keep busy, and clean. It helped her deal with the emotional turmoil in her head and her heart. While she tried on the various skirts, deciding what to keep and what to toss in the donation pile, she thought about a possible future with Chris. She had a life here. He had a company and family in Colorado. Chris was leaving right after Christmas. Could they make a long-distance relationship work? Would he even want to? Amy tried not to read too much into the single kiss they'd shared. But what if? The thought that a relationship with Chris could work wouldn't leave her. What if? What if she was ready for a fresh start? Her store was close to going under. She could move out to Colorado and start over. Aside from Chloe and Miss Doris, who or what was really holding her here on Palmar Island? Amy wasn't quite ready to commit to the idea, but it felt nice to leave herself open to the possibility. It was good to feel hope. She kept working through the pile of clothes on her bed, and then moved on to the collection of shoes piled into the bottom of her closet. 30 minutes later, the keepers were neatly arranged on the small shoe shelf she'd placed inside. She added all other pairs to the donation bag. All that was left to work through was the shelf on top of the hanging bar. Amy went to the kitchen and grabbed the small step stool she used to reach things in the top cabinets. Returning with it to the bedroom, she started to pull bags, sweaters and boxes from the shelf. She stacked everything on the floor and wiped down the shelf before starting to sort through the stack. The sweaters went into her dresser now that she had plenty of room in there. Owning fewer clothes felt nice. Like a burden lifting off her shoulders. She briefly wondered what it would feel like to no longer own the shop. Shaking her head, she quickly sorted through her collection of purses, adding a few to the donation pile, not ready to make that particular decision. The rest went neatly arranged onto the top shelf. The last things to deal with were the 3 small cardboard boxes. She was getting tired and was tempted to simply shove them back up there and be done with it. But that would be cheating. What did her father always say? If you're going to do a job, you might as well do it right. Sighing, she lowered herself to the floor and opened the first box. It held some of her college paperwork, including the report on spider lilies. She smiled. It had been a fun project. She closed the box and put it back on the shelf. The next held a bunch of pictures. A lot of them were from her college days. She should make an effort to get back in touch with some of her friends. It had only been a few years since they all graduated, but after her move to Palmar Island, she hadn't reached out with her new contact information. She lingered a little longer on the older pictures. There were plenty of shots of her and Adam as kids. Running around in the yard, opening presents at Christmas, blowing out birthday candles. Only a handful of the images were of her dad. She missed her father. Keeping out one picture of the three of them sitting on the beach, this box went back on the shelf as well. The last box was tricky. It had the word private on it, in her father's handwriting. With Adam enlisted, the job of cleaning out her father's apartment after he passed away a little over 3 years ago had fallen to Amy. Adam had gotten leave for the funeral, but had returned to his ship a few days later. The box was one of the few things she'd taken back with her. She remembered shoving it in the corner of her closet. It had been there ever since. Amy went in the kitchen to get a glass of water. Carrying it back with her, she sat down in front of the box. Slowly drinking the cool liquid, she tried to decide if she was ready to see what was inside. Her father's words kept repeating in her head. She put down her glass, took a deep breath, and opened it. At the very top, she found a folder that held both hers and Adam's high school diplomas, along with a picture of Adam in uniform and copies of her dad's will and the divorce agreement. Below that she found a stack of paintings and other little craft projects she and her brother must have made as kids. She thought she remembered painting the purple dog in elementary school. It looked a little like Duke. She smiled and pulled the picture out. Amy decided to frame it and hang it up in the kitchen. The very bottom of the box held a small bundle of letters. They were tied with a green ribbon. Amy cradled the bundle in her lap and untied it. She recognized the letters right away. She and Adam had written them to their mother in the weeks and months after she'd left. Tears sprang into her eyes, and she wiped them away furiously. The woman didn't deserve them. She'd left. Elizabeth Gardner had walked out on her family when Amy was 9, and her little brother Adam was only 4. Their father had raised them on his own. It hadn't been easy, and the feeling of betrayal and loss had never quite left her. Amy's hands shook as she shuffled through the sealed and stamped letters. She remembered writing them. She thought back on feeling a small flame of hope in her heart with every letter she and Adam would put into the mailbox. Her little brother would spend the following weeks stalking the mailman and rushing up to the window anytime a car stopped in front of their house. Neither of them had realized that their letters never reached Elizabeth. If they did, their mother didn't bother reading them. Every single one had a return to sender stamp on the envelope. Amy sat on the floor, wallowing in sad childhood memories for quite some time before she could bring herself to repack the box, tape it up, and return it to the deepest, darkest corner of her closet. She curled up on the bed and thought about how ridiculous her earlier daydreams about Chris had been. Getting involved with him any more than she already had would only lead to heartbreak. He was leaving for Colorado in a few short weeks, and that would be that. She would be here, fighting to keep her little flower shop afloat. People left sooner or later. It was safer not to get too involved. A soft, wet nose pushed its way under her arms and into her face. Amy raised her head and looked at Duke. He was her constant companion, loyal to the core. She could count on him to stay with her no matter what happened. She hugged the beagle close to her for a moment before he started to wriggle out of her embrace. Duke hopped off the bed and walked toward the door, turning to look back at Amy. He was ready to go out for a walk. Amy climbed down as well and grabbed a warm sweater. A little fresh air would do her good. It was time to stop the pity party and get ready for the afternoon's Christmas festivities. She grabbed Duke's leash, and they headed out for a quick jog around the block. They'd made it all the way to the four-way stop when she ran into the last person she expected to see. Mr. Leonard was walking down the sidewalk, a stainless steel travel mug in hand. "Good morning, Ms. Gardner," he said stiffly, keeping a wary eye on Duke. "Good morning." Amy pulled Duke's leash closer, and the pup settled down next to her feet, patiently waiting for them to resume their walk. Now that your boyfriend is buying the building, I guess you don't have to worry about paying rent anymore. I'm sure he'll get that awning fixed for you as well. I don't know what you did to talk him into it, but good for you. The office building project I needed the lot for fell through. His offer couldn't have come at a better time. He grinned widely and cold shivers went down Amy's spine. I'm sure I'll see you around, he said before walking off. Amy was stunned. She didn't know what to make of the comments. Office building? Was that what the nastiness and rent increases had been about? He wanted the land, not the building and tenants. And what was with the boyfriend comment? She didn't have a boyfriend. The only person she'd been seeing was Chris. Chris. Could he have made an offer on her building? He had the funds, and he knew she was in trouble. He'd offered to help, to talk to a lawyer friend of his, but he hadn't mentioned buying the building. He didn't say anything about it yesterday when they spent all evening baking and decorating cookies. He couldn't have, could he? Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, as she walked the familiar road back home as if she were on autopilot. By the time she got back to her apartment, her head wasn't any clearer, and she was more confused than ever. She picked up her phone and decided to give Chris a call to clear this up. Better to do it now than to have that conversation in public at the shelter later. Her fingers trembled, and it took her several tries to make the call. Everything okay? Chris asked when he answered. Do you need me to come over and bake another batch of cookies? His light tone calmed her. No, I think there are plenty. I'm calling about something else. I ran into Mr. Leonard while I was walking Duke, and he mentioned something about you making an offer to buy the building. Is that right, or did I misunderstand? I did. Chris's voice was neutral, his answer short and to the point. Amy waited for a moment to see if he would elaborate. He didn't. You don't have to do this, you know. I'm a big girl. I can deal with Leonard, or I can move the shop to a different location. I don't need you to buy. I'm not. You're not buying it? I thought you said, Chris interrupted her. I'm buying the building, but not because of you. At least, not just because of you. It's a great location, and I was able to get it at a fair price. It's a good investment for my company. She could hear him pull out a chair. He must be in the little dining nook in the guest cottage. I've been thinking about creating a secondary office. A place where my programmers can come and hang out when they get stuck. Think of it as a mix between an office and a retreat. So you're not buying it out of charity? To keep my rent low? Amy asked, trying to comprehend what he was saying. I'm not, though if it's okay with you, I'd like to roll the rent back to what it was 6 months ago. I think that's only fair. Amy nodded, then realized what she was doing. That's kind of you, thank you, she said. Of course. As soon as the paperwork is signed, I'll have someone come over to look at the plumbing. It may be a little while for the big renovations to start, but we can fix the most urgent stuff right away. Someone should be coming by later this week to replace the awning. Amy couldn't believe her ears. Are you serious? And you're sure this isn't charity? She asked, teasing him just a little. She couldn't believe so many of her big worries were evaporating right in front of her eyes. Definitely not charity, just trying to be a decent landlord instead of a jerk. Wouldn't want you mad at me since I plan on spending a good bit of time down here. Chris's voice sounded like he was smiling at the admission. Amy couldn't keep the hope from bubbling up. She was grinning from ear to ear, wishing they'd had this conversation in person after all. She could hug him, maybe even kiss him. Okay, she'd definitely be kissing him if he stood in front of her right now. All right then, she said. I like that. Good. I'll see you in a couple of hours, Chris said before ending the call. Amy couldn't wait. Chapter 7. Hello? Chris answered the call from an unknown number with an 808 area code. Chris, it's Jonathan." The man at the other end of the line paused. Chris took a deep breath. He was too shocked to respond. "Listen, I know I'm probably the last person you ever want to hear from again." Jonathan got that right. Why would he expect to hear from the guy that had planned to ruin him, and who had slept with his fiancée behind his back? Worse, Jonathan had known of Julia's plan to marry him without a prenup and then take half of everything Chris owned in the divorce. Chris didn't know which one of them had come up with the idea in the first place. It didn't matter. His friendship with Jonathan was a thing of the past. "Why are you calling me?" he asked, trying to keep the anger and resentment he felt from creeping into his voice, and failing miserably. "I'm in Hawaii." Chris had assumed as much from the area code. "Julia and I flew out here a couple of weeks ago. We got into a fight last night and she left. She cleared out my accounts and took my credit cards." Jonathan sounded tired. Served him right. Chris tried hard not to laugh at the picture of his former best friend waking up to the mess he was in. His anger vanished, and he had to work hard to suppress a laugh. If this wasn't karma in action. "I still don't know what you want from me." Chris wasn't going to make this easy for Jonathan. "The hotel won't let me leave without settling the bill." Jonathan paused, and Chris could hear him take a deep breath. "And I have no way to pay them or buy a plane ticket out of here. I'm stuck and didn't know who else to call." Chris waited. He was going to make Jonathan say it out loud. He deserved to hear the guy beg him for help. He cleared his throat. "And? Is there any way you could send me some cash? I swear I'll pay you back as soon as I am back on my feet. I don't care what kind of interest you want, I just have to get out of here, man. Please?" Chris let that sit for a minute. He was tempted to tell the guy no, or hang up on him, but his conscience wouldn't let him do that. His parents had raised him better than that. Jonathan had been a good friend for years. He had helped Chris secure funding for the startup and done an amazing job as the company's first CFO. As much as Chris wanted to hate the guy, he did owe him. "What's the name of the hotel?" he asked, writing it down on the small notepad Miss Doris had set on the side table for her guests' use. "I'll see what I can do." He hung up the phone and paced the room, thinking about the best way to handle this. "Beth?" He called his office manager in Denver, glad to catch her before she was heading out to lunch. He kept forgetting about the 3-hour time difference. "I need you to get in touch with the Palm Island Resort on Maui and settle the bill for Jonathan Reese." "The Jonathan Reese?" Beth asked. "Yes, don't ask why." "Then book him on the next flight to LA, coach, and make it a middle seat." He could hear her clicking away on her computer, taking notes, or looking up flight information. She was efficient and quick. Chris had no doubt that Beth would have this dealt with quickly. "Anything else?" she asked. Chris thought for a moment. "Have the hotel pass on a message to Jonathan. Have them tell him I'm doing this out of respect for our friendship, under one condition. Have them tell Jonathan that I never want to hear from him again. No need to pay me back." "Okay, boss. Consider it done." He knew he could count on her. On second thought, wait an hour or two before you call the hotel back. He hung up the phone, put it down on the coffee table, and walked out to the beach. Sitting in the surprisingly warm sand, he let memories of Julia and Jonathan sweep over him. There was a time when he'd loved them both. That's what had allowed them to hurt him so badly. He couldn't get the images of their ultimate betrayal out of his mind. He'd found them kissing, laughing, and talking about their plan to fleece him for all his worth. If Sam hadn't shared her suspicions with him, he never would have followed Julia to the small hotel in Breckenridge. He wouldn't have snuck up to the half-closed door, and he wouldn't have found out who his bride-to-be really was, until it was too late. Thank God for Sam and her amazing instincts. No one else had thought anything but the best of Julia Fairchild. "Mind if I sit with you?" The soft voice startled Chris out of his thoughts. He didn't know how long he'd been on the beach, staring out on the water. He looked up and saw Sarah, Miss Doris's niece, standing next to him. Not at all. He held out his hand and helped her settle down in the sand next to him. He was grateful for the interruption. Looking over at the young woman, he noticed the worried look on her face. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. "As much as it can be." Sarah scooted around, trying to get more comfortable. After a bit of shuffling back and forth, she sat cross-legged in the sand, cradling her large, pregnant belly with her arms. It wouldn't be long before she gave birth. He waited to see if there was anything she wanted to get off her chest. They sat for a little while, watching the waves roll onto the beach, and a group of sandpipers running back and forth, pecking in the sand right at the waterline. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said a few moments later. Chris nodded. "Of course. How do you know if you can trust someone to stick around?" "I don't know. Maybe we have to try to give people the benefit of the doubt and then see if they prove us right?" His voice sounded unsure. Chris wished he had a better answer for her. "Thinking about someone in particular, or is this more of a general question about the state of humanity?" he asked. "It's about Ryan, Charlie's father." She rubbed her stomach. "We barely know each other." She looked up and he couldn't hide his surprised expression fast enough. Sarah laughed. "It's a long story, and not nearly as scandalous as it sounds." He'd have to take her word for it. At least until he got a chance to talk to Miss Doris about what this not-so-scandalous backstory was. "Raising a kid with someone you don't really know can't be easy," Chris said. "We're working on that." The getting to know each other part. Sarah smiled. That wasn't what had her worried then, Chris thought. He waited a few more heartbeats, giving the young woman space to share what weighed so heavily on her mind. "I guess what I'm wondering is, how do I know if he'll stick around? And what if he doesn't? I don't know if I can raise this baby by myself." She sounded scared. Chris could see her cheeks reddening, and she pulled her hair in front of her face, trying to hide her embarrassment. "You have your aunt," he said, wishing there was something he could do to make her feel better. "I know. Aunt Doris has been wonderful. I just wish I knew that whatever there is between Ryan and me is real. That he'll stick around and be there for the two of us." Her hand rubbed small circles on her belly. "I got engaged the summer before last," Chris said, surprising himself. "I thought Julia was the love of my life. We'd been dating for almost a year, and it seemed like the right time. Everyone loved her. The wedding was planned for Christmas Eve." He stopped and took a deep breath. Was he ready to share his whole sad story with someone who was basically a stranger? Sarah put a hand on his arm and sat there, waiting, ready to listen. "My friend Sam came out to visit. Her grandparents used to live in the house next door." He looked back over his shoulder and pointed to the old beach house next to Miss Doris's. "I think her brother owns it now." Sarah nodded, but kept quiet. "She helped me see what was really going on. Turns out that the entire time we were dating, Julia was also seeing Jonathan, my best friend who helped me get my company off the ground. He'd worked by my side as CFO, and knew everything there was to know about my finances and my net worth. Somewhere along the way, the two of them decided that Julia should marry me and then leave, taking half of what I owned in the divorce. I guess they figured that would give them the funds to lead the lives they wanted to have together." "I'm sorry." Chris looked up at Sarah's words. All he could see was her compassion. It was a nice change from the pity and glee he'd faced with the people around him in Colorado. "We canceled the wedding, and Julia left town with Jonathan. As far as everyone around town knew, she ran off with my best friend. It wasn't pleasant, but at least I didn't lose my shirt." Chris raised his head. He hadn't realized he'd been looking at his hands and the sand in front of him while he told his sad tale. He looked out over the ocean and realized for the first time that he was grateful his wedding plans fell apart. He was even thankful to Jonathan for taking off with Julia. As much as the betrayal still hurt, it had kept him from marrying a woman who only cared about his money. "I didn't expect to ever hear from either of them again." He turned and looked at Sarah. Her gaze was still on him. She seemed as swept up in his sad tale as he was. He called me a little while ago. Chris barked out a sad excuse of a laugh. He's stuck in Hawaii up to his eyeballs in hotel bills. Julia left him stranded without cash or credit cards. I was the only one he could think of to call to bail him out. Did you? Sarah's eyes twinkled with mirth. I did. At the end of the day, I couldn't leave him there, knowing she did to him what they tried to do to me. Chris glanced down at his watch. He should know I did by now. I made him sweat it out a little first though. Can I ask you a personal question? Sarah asked a little while later. Chris nodded. After all that, how do you make sure the next person doesn't try to do the same thing? How do you trust that it will work out? Chris chewed on Sarah's question for quite some time. How could you trust that a relationship would work out? He wished that he believed what he had told Sarah in response. You have to take the risk if you want a shot at love and happiness. He wanted to believe it. Until that happened, he would take it one day at a time. He'd enjoy getting to know Amy better and see what their future held. Today, that future held a double date with Sam and Jason. I can't believe we're going to see the Christmas show at the Carolina Opry. Amy's eyes were all over the place as they walked through the tall lobby. Large Christmas trees stood flanking each side of the sweeping staircases that lead to the upper balcony. A choir was lined up on one, singing a medley of Christmas carols. Over here. Sam waved at them, and they joined the other couple to listen to the choir for a few minutes. I wonder what high school they're from, Sam said. My friend Misha went to school in the area and got to come up here with choir. She loved it. The students finished their last set of Christmas songs and filed from the stairs into the main theater. Anyone want drinks and popcorn? Jason asked. Chris looked at Amy and she shook her head. We're good. Sam echoed his words. Shall we then? The four of them headed up the stairs and to the center balcony. These seats are amazing. Amy was beaming as they sat. Their front and center location gave them a full view of the entire stage. Chris noticed that if he leaned forward just a little, he could see a good part of the audience on the main level as well. The group of high school students from earlier were still busy taking their own seats. Have you seen the show before? Sam asked Amy. Amy shook her head. I've been meaning to come since I moved down here. I just never made the time. Sam nodded. You'll love it. I try to make it at least once before Christmas. I have to drag Jason kicking and screaming though. Amy laughed. It's not that bad, is it? Chris turned to Jason in mock concern. You'll see, Sam's husband replied, playing along. The lights dimmed, and the music started playing. Chris was pleasantly surprised. He knew the show would be good. He didn't think it would be his thing, but found himself quite entertained by it. Much of that had to do with the fact that Amy and Sam were really enjoying themselves. They had their heads together like little schoolgirls, whispering and pointing at some of the performers. One of the younger musicians seemed to have caught their eye. Joel is amazing. I can't believe he plays guitar, piano, and the drums. And that voice. Sam and Amy were walking out of the theater next to each other during the mid-show intermission, chatting like they'd been friends for ages. We're heading to the girls' room, Sam said, after they'd filed out the double doors and into the lobby. Would you get us some popcorn and soda? She batted her eyes at Jason. Sure, her husband replied good-naturedly. Amy? Chris looked at his date. She looked stunning in another long wool skirt, black boots, and a form-fitting black turtleneck. Popcorn and soda would be great. Chris nodded. No caffeine if possible, Amy said over her shoulder as Sam dragged her down the hall. This isn't half bad, he said to Jason while they stood in line at the concession stand. The smell of buttered popcorn was thick in the air. It made his mouth water and his stomach growl. He had worked through lunch, and his virtual team meeting had gone longer than he'd expected. Chris had to rush to make it in time to pick up Amy. Don't tell Sam I said this, but it really isn't. Not something I'd want to do every week, but not bad. Jason looked up at the board and Chris followed suit. Popcorn, soda, and cookies were the extent of the snack bar offerings. He'd hoped for something a little more substantial, like a hot dog maybe, but the popcorn would have to do until dinner. Chris caught snippets of conversation from the group of teenage girls in front of them. Isn't Joel the best? He is. He's so cute. Can you believe he's only 23? How do you know? Didn't you read his bio in the program? He's the latest addition to the cast, and he loves playing video games. His favorite food is fried chicken. Let me see that. One of the girls grabbed the printed program from the first one. A third young woman, wearing the same long black dress, clearly another choir member, walked up, a small plastic bag in her hand. They sell signed pictures of Joel at the gift shop. The girl squealed loud enough to attract the attention of half the people in the lobby, before dashing off in the direction of the shop. Jason shot Chris a knowing glance and shook his head. At least it was speeding up the line. What can I get you? The young man behind the counter asked. Jason rattled off his order. Chris added a large bucket of popcorn and 2 sodas. Do you have cheer wine? He asked. Afraid not. A Coke and a Sprite then. By the time they walked off, hands full of snacks and drinks, Sam and Amy were back from the restroom. In case you're interested, they sell autographed copies of your crush in the gift shop. Jason teased his wife, who had already snatched up one of the buckets of popcorn. You might have to fight that group of high school girls for them, though. I think we're good, Sam said before placing a kiss on Jason's cheek. We're here with the 2 most handsome guys, right Amy? Chris glanced over at his date out of the corner of his eye. She nodded, color rising in her cheeks. That was good. Chris put his knife and fork down and leaned back in his chair. The steak and cheese fries had hit the spot. He picked up his beer and took a big swig before looking around the table. The 4 of them had driven out to Broadway at the beach for dinner, and had ended up at one of the steak houses. The girls had suggested sushi, but Chris and Jason had both put their foot down. Steak was the least they deserved after sitting through that show, they'd declared. Jason was taking the last bite of his own steak. Definitely the right call, coming here. He nodded at Chris. The 2 of them were getting along well, and Chris looked forward to spending more time with the guy. Jason had invited him to go fishing on the pier next week. It was yet another reason to consider moving down here for part of the year. I hate to cut this short, but I'm tired. It's been a long week. Sam yawned and Chris noticed the pleading look she shot Jason. You 2 go ahead. Dinner's on me, Chris said. Sam smiled and nodded her thanks. She looked over at Amy. This was a lot of fun. I hope we can do it again soon. Next time, let's leave the boys at home. She rose and walked over to give Amy a quick hug. Would you like some dessert? Chris asked after Sam and Jason left. Amy shook her head. He waved their waitress over and requested the check. A few minutes later, they were stepping out of the restaurant. How about a walk around to look at lights before we head back home, he suggested, not quite ready to call it a night. That would be lovely. Amy hooked her arm in his and they strolled around the shops toward the large Christmas tree display. All I Want for Christmas by Mariah Carey was playing through the outdoor speakers. Chris pulled Amy a little closer as they stepped through the crowd. It was surprising how many people were still shopping and going out to eat. The place was hopping. I'd been meaning to ask you. Have you heard from the shelter about their final numbers? Chris asked. By the time I left, they'd sold most of the cookies and pies. Amy looked up at him, the tiny lights from the decorations all around them sparkling in her eyes. Her mouth raised into a smile that made him want to kiss those pretty pink lips. He swallowed hard. It was a huge success. They sold out completely. Amy's entire face lit up. So the dog park is a go, he asked. Yes. They made their goal and then some. Someone dropped off a large anonymous donation. That wouldn't have been you, would it? Amy asked. I have no idea what you're talking about. Chris had to look away, and focused on the display of one of the windows instead. Thank you. Amy put her arm around his waist. He lifted his own arm to put across her shoulders and pulled her closer. They continued to stroll around the place, looking at decorations and holiday-themed window displays, while listening to the Christmas music that continued to play all across the entertainment property. If someone would have told Chris a month ago that he would enjoy walking around a place like this soaking up the holiday spirit, he would have told them they were crazy. So much had changed in the few weeks he'd spent on Palmar Island. Not only did he get his love for Christmas back, he was happy. Genuinely happy. He was finally letting go of Julia and everything that had happened a year ago. The call from Jonathan had been a good thing. It was cathartic. He felt free. Free to reinvent his life here on the South Carolina coast, and free to love the beautiful woman walking by his side. Amy, Chris wanted to tell her, but didn't know how to put into words everything he was feeling. When she looked at him with those stunning brown eyes, all conscious thought flew from his mind. The crowd, the shops, the lights, and the music disappeared. All he could see was her beautiful face, framed by her soft, honey-colored hair. All he could smell was the hint of vanilla and coconut scent that was uniquely hers. All he could hear was her breath and the small gasp she let out when he lowered his head to kiss those perfect pink lips. Chris heard the yelp before he could feel Amy fall into him. His eyes shot up. My purse. Her voice was full of panic, her face turned in the direction of the vanishing thief. Chris sprang into action, racing down the crowded walkway, chasing after the man with the dark hoodie who had snatched Amy's bag. He bobbed and weaved in between people, dodging strollers and toddlers. He kept up with the guy for a little while, even gained a bit of ground. Eventually though, Chris lost him in the hustle and bustle of all the Christmas shopping going on around him. I didn't catch him, Chris huffed, after returning to a shocked Amy a little while later. He was out of breath after the sprint. He hugged her to his chest, feeling her shake. It'll be okay, he murmured into her hair. We'll figure this out. All my keys are in there. To the shop, to my house. I can't get into my house. He could hear the panic in her voice. Duke is at home by himself. He's locked in there. Chris gently nudged her out of the hug so he could look at her. Amy, does anyone have a spare key? He asked. Did you give one to Miss Doris? Amy shook her head. Chloe has one to the house and the shop. The thought seemed to calm her. All right. Let's go get the keys, check on Duke, and file a police report. Chris took her hand, and they walked to his car. Chloe was shocked when they showed up on her doorstep, but quickly found Amy's spare house key. Less than an hour after the incident, they were at Amy's where Duke greeted them, happy to see them, and ready to go out for his evening walk. After Chris's gentle nudging, Amy had spent the drive home canceling her credit cards, locking her bank account, and filing a police report. Chris pondered what else they needed to do. He wanted Amy to feel safe, and that wasn't going to happen as long as someone was out there with her keys. I'm going to make some calls and see if I can get someone out here to change the locks, he told her while she was feeding Duke. You don't need to. He cut her off. Yes, I do. I want to. Chris walked into the living room to make the call. Looking down on his phone, he was surprised to see that it was just 9 o'clock. The first locksmith he called was happy to come out right away when Chris offered him a cash bonus for the late evening house call. They sat on the steps, watching Duke run up and down the deserted sidewalk in Amy's neighborhood, waiting for the man to arrive. They didn't have to wait long, and the man changed the locks to Amy's front and back door quickly before handing her the new keys. Thank you, Amy said after they returned inside. This does make me feel better. I didn't realize how much the idea of someone out there having my keys bothered me. She dropped down on the couch. This is such a mess. Why do people do stuff like that? He sat down next to her and pulled her close. I don't know. Chapter 8. Amy couldn't believe how quickly her life was back to normal after the purse-snatching incident. The police had retrieved her bag with everything but her phone, cash and credit cards still inside. The thief had tossed it on top of the dumpster behind one of the stores. There were no leads in the case, and unless someone used her credit cards, there was little to no chance they would catch whoever did this, but Amy could live with that. Chris had set her up with one of those identity theft security programs, and her bank was working with law enforcement to monitor any card activity. She wasn't sure what she would have done without Chris. Well, she'd have dealt with it, but Amy knew it would have taken her much longer, and it was nice to be able to share the burden with someone. Duke's bark startled her out of her thoughts. Amy walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the road in front of her. Chris's car was parked out there, and he and Miss Doris were walking up to her door. "Ready to go, Duke?" she asked. He looked at her with his "what kind of question is that" look, followed by another excited bark, and a wagging tail she knew wouldn't stop until they were back from the parade. Duke was a people dog, and there was nothing he loved better than a crowd. Amy grabbed her sweater, and the new anti-theft purse Chris had insisted on buying for her, before fastening Duke's leash to his collar. By the time the doorbell rang, they were ready to walk out the door. "I can't wait to watch the parade," Miss Doris said as they walked to Chris's car. "The two of you have done such an amazing job. We should stand by your shop, Amy." Amy and Duke climbed into the back seat, letting Miss Doris ride in the passenger seat up front. Amy looked up, and her eyes met Chris's in the rearview mirror. They exchanged a secret little smile behind the older woman's back. Miss Doris had no idea that she was getting her own float, and that the three of them would ride on it. Duke would be up there too, of course. Amy was sure that the charming dog would steal the show. She patted his head, doing her best to keep him off the seat of Chris's SUV. They spent the next hour directing the lineup of the floats. Everything went smoothly, and Miss Doris couldn't stop praising them for their hard work organizing it all. She was flitting back and forth between the various floats, admiring the design and workmanship. "This is going to be the best parade yet," she finally declared before walking up to the next to last float. "What's going on with this one? Why is no one here?" she asked, a confused and worried look on her face. "Because that's your float," Jim Falcon boomed as he stepped around the front of his truck. It was hooked up to the trailer, and from what Amy could tell, everything was ready to go. Amy glanced over at Chris and then back to Miss Doris. She still didn't know how they'd been able to keep the secret. She'd come close to spilling the beans several times. Yet, here they were, and the look on her friend's face, along with the serious tongue-biting Amy had to do in order to keep it a last-minute surprise, was worth the time and effort it took to put the float together. "A float? For me?" Miss Doris's hand clutched her chest, and Amy could see tears pooling in the corners of the older woman's eyes. She hoped they were tears of joy. "You did all this?" Miss Doris shook her head as she walked around the simple float, admiring it. Amy felt relief wash over her. Those were definitely tears of joy. The design was simple. There hadn't been time for anything elaborate, but the stacks of wrapped presents that made up much of the float looked nice. Miss Patty from church had made elaborate bows for each from wide ribbon in a variety of different colors that complemented the wrapping paper they had used to cover the large cardboard boxes. Chris and Jim Falcon had built the small plywood platform that held 3 bolted-down chairs. A small crowd of parade participants started to gather around the float. Word started to spread about the float that Amy, Chris, and a few other prominent members of the community built for Miss Doris. "Well deserved, Miss Doris," Doug Chaplin said, walking up to shake her hand. "I can't believe it took Chris here to come up with the idea. We should have done it a long time ago." He stepped back and grabbed Chris's shoulder. "Glad you decided to spend Christmas here. I hope you stick around." Amy could see how uncomfortable both Chris and Miss Doris looked, and jumped into action. "Listen up everyone," she said with an amount of confidence and authority that surprised her and those around her. "Let's get this parade started. Time to board those floats." She looked around at the beaming faces before everyone started to rush back to their creations. Chris and Jim helped Miss Doris up on the float. Amy climbed on behind her, Duke scrambling up with the help of a big push by Chris. The young man was last to get on the float, jumping up easily with a hand on the trailer in a move that made Amy's mouth dry. She swallowed hard before taking her seat next to Miss Doris. "He's really something, isn't he?" the older woman murmured. Amy could feel her cheeks turning red. She bent down to dig around in her purse and produced 3 bright red Santa hats with fluffy white baubles. She put one on herself before handing the other 2 to Chris and Miss Doris. "These are a great idea." Miss Doris pulled on her hat and adjusted herself in her seat as the parade started to move. It was going to be a long 2 hours of waving and smiling. Chris took his seat and squeezed her hand in silent support. Amy glanced at the older woman, and the joy and excitement on her face made it all worthwhile. Miss Doris can't stop talking about riding in the parade. Amy smiled up at Chris as they strolled through the Palmar Island Christmas market. Miss Doris had told her that the event had started out decades ago as a small holiday market where you could buy a tree, a few trinkets, and warm up with a cup of homemade hot cocoa. Over the years it grew, and now it was more of a Christmas festival than a simple market, and it drew crowds from all across the Grand Strand region each weekend in December. "I'm glad she had fun." Chris grabbed her hand and pulled her closer. "What do you want to do first?" Amy looked around the place, keeping a firm grip on Duke's leash. There were booths that sold an assortment of Christmas decorations, food and drink. A little further down was a large carousel and various areas set up with games and activities for the kids, including a big pile of fake snow and an ice skating rink. "I can't decide," Amy said, her eyes continuing to roam over the place. "Let's just walk around and take it all in." She could see Chris nod out of the corner of her eye, and they started to stroll around. "Is that Sarah over there?" Chris asked a moment later. "It is." "Sarah." Amy waved and called her pregnant friend's name. The young woman and Ryan Beckheim, Sarah's boyfriend and the father of her unborn child, were strolling from the carousel area across part of the market. "I don't think they can hear us," Chris said. "That's okay. We'll catch up with them later." Amy wasn't worried. "Sarah looks happy." Chris smiled. "She does," he said a moment later. "She must have decided to trust it." "Trust what?" Amy asked, curious about the strange tone his voice had taken. "Thick and meaningful." "Trust her feelings," he said, before brushing a strand of hair off her face. His fingers barely brushed her cheeks, yet the simple touch sent tingles down her neck and spine. His head lowered to hers, and he pressed a quick kiss on her nose. "Such a pretty little nose," he murmured. Amy smiled a little through the disappointment she was feeling about the small peck. That feeling didn't last long. He didn't lift his head. Instead, his mouth trailed from her nose to her mouth. She could feel his lips gently brushing across hers. It was a light touch, a silent question. She answered by stepping in, closing the minuscule distance between their bodies. She could feel his hand in her hair, pulling her even closer in response, angling her head just a little to the side, allowing him to deepen the kiss. All she could see and feel was Chris. His lips melting into her own. His firm chest pressed against hers. His aftershave mixed with the scent that was so uniquely him, blocking out the sweet smell of popcorn, waffles, and hot chocolate. She didn't care that they were standing in the middle of the Christmas market. She couldn't hear the holiday tunes over the racing beat of her heart. She was lost in the kiss. They both were, until she could feel someone bumping into Chris. "Get a room, you two," a man said, and Amy opened her eyes. Chris's face was just inches from hers, and his eyes locked with hers. "He has a point." His voice sounded rough. Chris pressed a small kiss to her forehead, before taking a hesitant step back. Amy wondered if he was as reluctant as she was to break their connection. Then she realized where they were, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. They were making out like teenagers in the middle of a public event. There was no telling who had seen them. Customers, someone from the council. She hoped the man who had bumped into them wasn't anyone she knew. Chris's last words filtered into her consciousness. I don't think we should, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought out loud. Chris looked confused for a moment. Oh. I didn't mean that we should, he looked as embarrassed as she felt. I wasn't trying to get you alone. I meant that he had a point, that this wasn't the time and place to kiss you like that. Relief washed through her. They were still on the same page. Good, she said before wrapping her arm around his waist, looking around for something to distract them. Duke realized they were ready to get moving again, and started to pull on his leash. Amy decided to follow his lead. She laughed when they found themselves walking right up to a stand that sold hot dogs, brats, and turkey legs. Are you hungry? She asked Chris. He shook his head. Sorry buddy, she told the dog. Maybe later. Let's go check out the music. They walked closer to the stage, set up in the center of the town square, to see the small band that was playing. It was 3 young guys with a drum set, a bass, and a guitar. The voice of the guy singing sounded familiar. That's Joel Fisher from the Opry the other night, Amy exclaimed. She hadn't expected to see him here. I think you're right, Chris said. I'm surprised he's not performing there tonight. Maybe it's his day off? Amy nodded. They stood next to each other, a little off to the side, so Duke wasn't in danger of getting trampled by the small crowd that was gathering close to the stage. Joel was just as good as he'd been the other night, and his looks didn't go unnoticed by the girls and young women in the crowd. Looks like the girls are fangirling over him, just as bad or worse than the other night, she said. He must be loving all the attention and adoration. Chris looked at the crowd in front of them for a moment and then shook his head. He leaned in closer so she could hear him over the crowd without the need to shout. I think he only has eyes for her. He pointed at a beautiful young woman with shoulder-length honey-colored hair. Amy watched the young singer for a few minutes and nodded. You're right. I wonder if there's a story between those two. I bet there is, Chris replied with confidence. Amy smiled and snuggled a little closer to him. She looked down to check on Duke. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't there. The leash and collar were hanging by her side with no dog in sight. How had she not noticed? Duke's gone, she said, turning to Chris in a panic. What? How? Chris looked as confused and worried as she felt. He must have wiggled out of his collar somehow. I don't know how I didn't notice. Chris jumped into action. He has to be around here somewhere. He looked around and started walking toward the game booths and the carousel. Amy followed behind. Together, they searched the entire fair, eyes darting back and forth. What if he runs into Main Street and gets hit by a car? She asked. And there are so many little kids around. What if he feels threatened and bites a child? She could feel the panic continue to rise in her throat. Hey. Chris stopped and pulled her into a quick hug. Duke's a smart dog. I've watched him when we walked him. He knows better than to run into traffic. And he loves kids. Do you really think he would do anything to harm one of them? Amy shook her head, feeling a little better. But where was he? Amy's phone rang while they were making their second pass through the crowd. She pulled it out of her purse and fumbled with the screen. The phone that Chris had insisted on buying for her, when her last one was lost in the purse theft, was still unfamiliar. Why was Chloe calling her? Is Duke missing by chance? Amy's friend asked. We were standing in line for food when he walked up. He doesn't have his collar on, but I swear it's Duke. Relief flooded through Amy, and within minutes they found Chloe, Toby, and Duke. Toby was sitting on the ground behind the stand of one of the food vendors, feeding Duke small pieces of bratwurst while petting him and telling him to stay. The dog jumped up when he saw Amy, and ran toward her, tail wagging. He looked at her with those big puppy eyes and nuzzled her neck while she put the collar back on him, adjusting it to be tight enough that he couldn't work his way out of it. You're in trouble, mister, she told the dog, who continued to wag his tail, responding to the relief in her voice instead of the words. She turned to Chloe. I can't thank you enough. I've been so worried. Thank you for finding him. She hugged her friend, tears threatening to flow now that the danger was over. Chloe broke their hug and pointed her chin suggestively towards something behind Amy. When Amy looked back, she saw Chris squatted down next to Toby. Duke had returned to the young boy's side, hoping for more sausage. Thank you for keeping Duke here by sharing your food with him, Chris said. That was pretty clever. Her heart started beating faster, seeing Chris talk to Toby and petting Duke. Chloe nudged into her and smiled. Amy had a pretty good feeling what her friend was thinking, and she wasn't wrong. Duke's a good dog, Toby said, his earnest little face shining with the grease of the bratwurst he'd been sharing. He is, Chris said. And you've been good too. I think your action tonight deserves a reward. Is there something you would like to do while we're here? Toby looked up and glanced around the fair. Can we go play with the snowballs? He asked. Amy looked back at the fenced-off area, not far from the carousel they'd passed a few times. It was full of young kids and a few adults, all throwing fuzzy white balls that looked surprisingly like snowballs at each other. They were initially kept in large bins, one per side, and every so often the attendant would blow a whistle and everyone would get busy collecting the snowballs, returning them to their bins. Then the snowball fight would resume with much laughing and shouting all around. Chris looked at Chloe. Would it be okay if I took him? He asked. Chloe nodded and the two of them walked off, Toby chatting excitedly at Chris. He's good with kids, Chloe said when they were out of hearing range. Amy knew better than to fall for the bait and kept quiet. Her friend didn't let up though. He'd make a good dad, don't you think? He would. Amy agreed. And? I'm not sure it's a good idea for me to have kids, Amy admitted. You know about my mom. I can't risk being a complete failure like her and running off. Oh, honey, is that what this has been about? You are not your mother. You won't abandon your children. I don't know the woman, but I know enough to realize that you are nothing like her. You would make a wonderful mother. For the second time in less than 15 minutes, Chloe wrapped her arms around Amy and pulled her into a close hug. Amy wanted to believe her friend, but could she risk it? Chapter 9. Chris glanced down at the clock in his car. He was early and couldn't wait to take Amy out to dinner. Miss Doris had ambushed him on his way out and demanded to know what he was up to, dressed in a suit and tie. He smiled at the memory of the older woman straightening his tie and telling him to go get the girl. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, making sure the small velvet box was there. His errand at the jeweler's hadn't taken as long as he'd expected it to take. He hoped the ring he had chosen would fit. If not, it could easily be resized tomorrow, the friendly salesman had assured him. Chris smiled at the thought of Amy's surprised look when he presented her with this early Christmas gift over dinner at Chez Paul's. Chris reached Amy's neighborhood and pulled up behind a Jeep Cherokee parked in front of her house. He didn't recognize the vehicle. Chris had just turned off the car and the headlights when he saw Amy's front door open. He watched her step out with a young man. The guy had dark hair, and even in the dim light, Chris could tell he was good-looking. He had no idea who the guy was. Chris watched Amy and the man hug. It wasn't the kind of hug you gave to a friend. This was personal, intimate. Their faces were close together. In this light, he couldn't quite make out if they were talking or kissing. This couldn't be happening. Not again. His worst nightmare was coming true. Amy was seeing someone else behind his back. She just needed him to save her shop. And he'd been thinking about proposing to her tonight. How stupid was he? He barely knew this woman, and it should be obvious by now that he was a horrible judge of character. He had to give it to her though. Amy had even fooled Sam. Sitting in the front seat of his dark car, parked just a few yards away from Amy's front door, he watched her press a kiss to the man's cheek. He walked off to his car, waving at her as he got in. Her eyes were glued to the man and then the car he drove off in. Chris watched her pull her cardigan around her body before she turned and walked back into the house. She hadn't seen him. When the front door closed, Chris let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. With shaking fingers, he turned the key in the ignition, turned on the lights and drove off. He couldn't face her. Couldn't listen to her lie and make up an excuse to explain away the boyfriend. He needed to get as far away from her and her house as he could. For tonight, that would mean heading back to Miss Doris's. By the time Chris got back to his cottage, the text messages from Amy started coming in. He glanced at the screen of his phone as he walked in. Amy texted, "Running late?" Chris walked into the kitchen and splashed some cold water on his face. His phone beeped again. Amy texted, checking in. "We're still on for dinner?" He put the phone down on the kitchen table and started pacing the room. He should end this. Tell her it was over and he knew what she was up to. Chris didn't think he had it in him tonight. Amy texted, "I wasn't supposed to meet you at the restaurant, was I? You're picking me up, right?" His phone rang. Chris didn't have to look at it to know it was Amy. He didn't answer. He couldn't talk to her. Instead, he headed to the small bathroom to take a shower and change into a t-shirt and sweats. By the time he got back, rubbing his wet hair with a towel, there were 2 more messages waiting for him. Amy texted, "Please call me." Amy texted, "I'm getting worried. Let me know if you're okay. Call me." Chris couldn't talk to her. He couldn't listen to the lies he knew she would come up with in a vain attempt to win him back. By the time a voicemail notification popped up, he was done. He held the power button on his phone until it went dark. As dark as his heart and any hope for a future with Amy by his side. Chris woke up the next morning with a raging headache. Stress always did this to him. He was tempted to call Jack and have him bring the plane in early. He went as far as pulling up his pilot's contact information. Then he thought better of it. The man had a family, 2 small kids who would need their dad home for Christmas. Chris could make it 2 more days here on Palmar Island. He would spend a few quiet days in the cabin catching up on work and then meet Jack at the airport in Myrtle Beach at 6:30 p.m. on the 26th as planned. For now, coffee and an aspirin would have to do. He climbed down from the sleeping loft and stumbled into the kitchen. He was downing the pain reliever with a big glass of water when he heard a knock at the door. "Miss Doris, please come in." "Excuse my appearance. I just woke up." Chris stepped back to let the older woman enter. She came bearing gifts. From the smell of it, the tea towel-covered basket contained more baked goods. "I brought you some banana bread." She set the basket down and looked him up and down. "Looks like you could use it." Miss Doris motioned for him to sit down at the table and poured him some coffee and added a slice of the baked confection to a small plate. The scene seemed eerily familiar. "This is good." "Thank you," Chris said, trying to figure out why she was here. "I talked to Amy this morning." Miss Doris sat down with her own cup of coffee. Ah, that explained the early morning visit. He glanced down at his watch. It was 10:30. Later than he thought. No wonder he felt so foggy. The headache wasn't helping, but he never thought clearly when he slept too long. Miss Doris added a spoonful of sugar to her own coffee and stirred it. The noise wasn't helping his headache. She smashed the spoon down on the wooden table. "I'm going to be blunt," Miss Doris said. "Why did you stand her up? I thought the 2 of you were getting along." Chris put his head in his hands. This was not the conversation he wanted to have this morning. By now he knew his landlady well enough to realize she wasn't going to leave until he explained himself. He took a deep breath and looked directly at her. "Because she's seeing someone else." "What are you talking about?" "Amy isn't seeing anyone. She's crazy about you." Miss Doris looked as confused as he felt. "I went over to her house last night. I was a little early and saw a man leave. It was obvious that they were close." The admission hurt, and it felt like his heart was breaking all over again. Despair threatened to flood through him, along with the memories of this betrayal and the last. He took a big gulp of hot coffee to distract himself. It was still boiling and burned all the way down his throat. He welcomed the slight pain. Miss Doris sat back in her chair and crossed her arms. She had a strange look on her face. Chris couldn't make out what it was. The older woman shook her head. "Boy, you messed up big time." "What?" He had no idea what Miss Doris was talking about. This was the last reaction he'd expected. Disbelief, yes. Pleading on behalf of her young friend for a second chance, sure. But an amused grin? "Don't look so confused. You messed up. Amy's visitor, the man you saw leave her house last night, is Adam, her brother." "What?" The words trickled into his mind, but they didn't make sense. "Amy has a younger brother. He's in the military and spends a lot of time overseas. He got a few hours of leave during an assignment back here, and stopped by to see Amy." Miss Doris's voice was full of mirth, with a hint of compassion. She reached over and patted his arm. "She's not seeing anyone else. She was hugging her brother. And you would have known that right away if you'd stepped out of your car and gone to see her." A brother. Amy had a brother named Adam. Thinking back, he thought she'd mentioned him in passing before. It didn't seem like someone that played a big part in her life. The job explained it. Adam wasn't around much, and there hadn't been the need to talk about him or a chance for her to introduce him to Chris. The visit may have been unexpected. It probably was. "You messed up," Miss Doris said. Chris nodded. Still too shocked for words. "How are you going to fix this?" "Amy is devastated." Chris cleared his throat. "I don't know. Better figure it out quickly. Tomorrow is Christmas, and no one deserves to be as miserable as the two of you look on that day." Miss Doris rose and patted him on the shoulder. "Talk to her," she suggested before walking out the door. Chris stood in front of her door and rang the doorbell. He had dressed in a pair of dark suit pants, a crisp dress shirt and a cashmere sweater over it. He could use all the help he could get in winning Amy back. The dozen white roses he was holding like a shield in front of himself were part of it. Amy opened the door. She looked nice in another dark wool skirt, boots and a form-fitting cream-colored sweater. She had pinned a small holly brooch close to her neck. "What are you doing here?" she asked as Duke darted past her and started jumping up his leg. At least someone was glad to see him. He petted the dog and looked back up at Amy. She looked tired, and her eyes were red and swollen, despite the light makeup she wore. It felt like a punch in the gut knowing he was the cause for those tears. "I'm sorry. I was hoping you would let me explain. About yesterday." She nodded and stepped back into her house. "Duke." The tone was clipped, and the beagle returned to his mistress's side immediately. He followed them into the small living room. Amy didn't sit down. She stood with her back against her bookshelf, arms wrapped protectively around her abdomen. "I don't have much time. I'm leaving for church in a few minutes." Chris nodded. "I'm an idiot. I should have talked to you." He held the roses out to her. "These are for you." Amy took them. That was a start. It gave him the confidence to continue. "I came by yesterday to pick you up for dinner." He swallowed hard. This wasn't easy, but something he needed to do. "I saw you hug another man. It made me see red, and I left." Amy raised the roses to smell them. "You thought I was seeing someone else behind your back?" It was as much a question as a statement. He nodded. "And that brought up a lot of bad memories for you." She lowered the flowers and he could see her face. The raw emotion took his breath away. She felt for him. She understood. The tiny flame of hope he'd carried in his heart since talking to Miss Doris roared up and grew into a raging plume of fire. He closed the distance between them, taking her face in his hands. It did, and I am so sorry. I was stupid. I should have talked to you. I should have trusted you. He leaned in and touched his forehead to hers. Then he waited. They stood together like this for a long moment. It was all he could do not to kiss her and beg her to take him back. But the ball was in her court. It needed to be her choice to forgive him. So Chris waited with his breath held. In the end, Amy said nothing. She raised her arms, still clutching the flowers that he could feel pushing into his shoulder and snagging on his sweater, as she hugged him. She lifted her face and pushed her lips on his, her eyes wide open and locking with his. It was the only answer he needed. Joy exploded in his heart as he deepened the kiss. It left them both a little breathless. He chuckled when she finally broke away, desperate for air. Does that mean I'm forgiven? Chris asked. Not that quickly, Amy replied, her face getting serious. You should have asked me who I was hugging. At the very least, you should have answered your phone when I called. I should have. Chris knew she was right. I get why you did what you did, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. She stepped away and around him, walking toward the kitchen. Chris followed behind. Will you let me try to make it up to you? Amy pulled a vase from the cabinet next to the stove and filled it with water. She grabbed the small packet of white powder attached to the bouquet and emptied it into the water. Yes. I will, because I know what caused this, and because you chose to reach out to me today. I would like us to work this out, and that involves talking about what happened back then and yesterday. Are you willing to do that? Chris hated that he couldn't see her face. She still had her back turned to him and had started clipping the ends of the rose stems and arranging the flowers in the crystal vase. I am, he said with as much sincerity as he could muster. He wasn't looking forward to talking about what had happened with Julia, but he owed that much to Amy, for his jumping to conclusions when he shouldn't have. And she was right. They needed to open up to each other if they wanted to make this work. Good. Not tonight, though. Amy glanced up at the clock on her stove. I have to leave for church. Mass is starting in 20 minutes. She took the flowers and placed them in the middle of the kitchen table, bending down briefly to smell them before she turned around and finally looked at him. Thank you for the roses. They are lovely. You're welcome. He smiled. Would you like some company at Mass? He asked. Amy nodded. It was a start. Come on in, Chris called, when he heard the knock and bark at his door. Merry Christmas. He pressed a small kiss on Amy's chilled cheek. Did you walk? I didn't hear a car. We did. I figured Duke could use the exercise. Less of a chance he'll tear up this place when he's tired. Amy's face was red. Chris wasn't sure if it was the cold air or the brisk 3-mile walk from her place. Cup of coffee to warm you up, he asked. Amy nodded and then slowly spun around. I thought you took all this down, she asked. I did. Chris shrugged. I got it all back from Miss Doris. He handed her a large cup of coffee. Thank you. Amy kissed him quickly. For all of this. It's festive and cozy all at the same time. She smiled and his heart warmed. It would take work, but she would forgive him. Because that's the kind and compassionate person his Amy was. What's all this? Amy asked when she walked over to the kitchenette area. Several aluminum trays were lined up, covered with thick foil. Christmas dinner. I hope you don't mind I had it catered. Trust me, you don't want to eat my cooking. He grinned at her. How did you manage that? We weren't planning on staying at your place until last night. Amy looked baffled. I called in some favors. He paused. Actually, Miss Doris pulled some strings with Ryan's grandfather, Joe Beckheim. He owns one of the large resorts up towards Myrtle Beach. Amy nodded. He had his staff pull something together for us, and had it delivered. That was very kind of him. And his staff. Amy looked a little uncomfortable. I made sure everyone was well compensated for the favor. Chris wasn't sure if the admission would help or hurt him. From the smile on Amy's face, he knew he'd made the right decision. Good. Amy peeked under the cover of one of the containers. This looks delicious. Not until later, he teased. Why don't we hang out for a while so you and Duke can warm up and rest a bit? Maybe go for a walk before we eat and then watch Christmas movies? Amy agreed, and Duke was already curled up on a thick rug in the main living area of the cottage, snoring softly. Didn't take him long to get comfortable, Amy said. They spent a lazy few hours snuggled up on the couch together listening to Christmas music and talking. They both skirted around the hard conversation they knew they needed to have about trust, enjoying the comfort of each other's company instead. When Duke started to get restless, Amy suggested they head out to the beach. The wind off the ocean was cool, but for December, the weather seemed surprisingly mild. He reached for Amy's hand as they walked along the water's edge toward the pier a mile down the beach. When I pulled up to your house 2 days ago. Amy squeezed his hand encouragingly. When I pulled up and saw you hugging that guy, I lost it. He looked down at his shoes, putting one foot in front of the other. It brought back memories of Julia and walking up on her and Jonathan. It was like déjà vu. He swallowed hard. Except it was worse this time. I didn't realize it until that night. I care more for you than I ever did for Julia. He looked up and saw the surprise in Amy's face. He forced a small smile to his face, and hoped he could convince her of what was in his heart. It's true. I almost married that woman, and turns out I didn't love her. Not really. I liked the idea of being in love and starting a family. She was pretty and easy to get along with. It was comfortable. He laughed dryly. Aside from the fact that it was completely fake on her part. I cared for her, but I never loved her. He paused. Not the way I feel about you. Chris stopped and stepped in front of Amy. He needed her to see him. I know I messed up, but I need you to know one thing. I love you, Amy Gardner. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone in my life. Amy reached up and cupped his face in her free hand. And I love you. She could feel a hint of stubble and couldn't resist the urge to rise onto her toes and brush her lips across his. That's as far as she got before Duke spotted a seagull landing not 10 feet from them and started running and barking towards it, pulling Amy behind him. She laughed and stumbled through the sand, working hard to get the dog under control. Maybe we'd better table the rest of this conversation until we're back at the house, Chris suggested. Ready to head back? Yes, and I think we're good. I understand why you overreacted. Just promise that you'll come to me next time, so we can talk it through, instead of running off. It was an easy promise to make. When they walked up from the beach, they could see Miss Doris and another woman working on the patio. Do you want some help? Chris called up to them. Miss Doris shook her head and waved him off. By the time they were back in the cottage, his stomach started growling. It was only early afternoon, much too early for Christmas dinner. Do you mind if we eat now? I'm starving, Amy said. Chris laughed. He loved it when they were on the same page. They had a lovely Christmas dinner with all the fixings, and pumpkin pie for dessert. They recovered from their food coma by watching White Christmas on Netflix, Duke curled up next to them on the couch. It felt right holding her in his arms, spending an easy and relaxed Christmas day together. Look, Amy said after they'd finished the movie. He stepped next to her and followed her gaze out the kitchen window towards the patio of Miss Doris's house. Sarah was walking up to Ryan and another man. It took him a moment to realize what was going on. They are getting married. Yes, Amy whispered. And look, Sarah had the baby. He could see Miss Doris holding the baby. They quietly watched the brief ceremony, which ended with Ryan and Sarah kissing. Chris hadn't realized that he'd wrapped his arms around Amy holding her close to him. He looked at her, and saw a single tear roll down her cheek. He reached up and gently wiped it away. "I always cry at weddings," Amy admitted. He kissed her soft hair. "Time to cheer you up then. How about a present?" he asked. He guided her back to the couch, and then turned to pull a box out from under the small Christmas tree. "This is for you." "It's beautiful," she said. "You didn't open it yet," he said with a smile. "How would you know?" "The package is beautiful. I love the paper." Amy untied the wide silver ribbon before carefully lifting the tape off the thick wrapping paper. "Poinsettias are my favorite." Chris had chosen it from Miss Doris's extensive stash of Christmas-themed wrapping paper when he'd asked her for help early this morning. He continued to watch her, wishing she'd hurry up and open the box. When she finally did, she looked confused. "This is a plane ticket," she said. He nodded. "To Paris, first class. We leave the day after tomorrow. I want you to see the City of Light on New Year's Eve." He held his breath, hoping she'd accept his gift. "I can't do this. I can't accept it. It's too much." Amy's face had turned red, and she looked equal parts surprised and excited. "Of course you can. I've talked to Chloe, she'll man the shop, and I've called Barry's pet hotel. They are happy to take care of Duke for a few days. Miss Doris offered to take him in, but I'm sure she'll have her hands full with Sarah and the baby." He was rambling and made himself stop. "I can't, it's too much." Amy couldn't keep her eyes off the ticket that was still nestled in a pile of red tissue paper in the box. "I want to take you." "Oh, do you not have a passport?" "We could try to get one fast-tracked, but with the holidays." Amy held up her hand to stop him. "No, I have a passport." "You really want to go? Just like that? To Paris?" "Of course. I can't think of a better way to start the new year, and the rest of our lives together." He hoped the kiss would convince her just how serious he was about this. About her. Epilogue. Amy couldn't believe it. She was here. In Paris. With Chris. The trip had been a dream come true. She felt like she needed to pinch herself to make sure she really was sitting at a cozy table for two at one of the most romantic spots in all of Paris, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. The past few days had been a whirlwind of packing, traveling, and exploring the City of Lights. They spent the day at the Louvre before strolling around Notre Dame Cathedral, surveying the damage the fire had done. Amy wished she could have seen the building in all its former glory, but in a way looking at it now was more impactful. It drove the point home that nothing in life is guaranteed to last, and that you should always make the most of it while you can. And that's exactly what she was doing. After all, how often did you get to spend New Year's Eve at the Terrace Hotel, enjoying a private rooftop dinner with the love of your life? The thought surprised her, but just a little. When Chris hadn't shown up for their dinner date a little over a week ago, she'd been worried and hurt when he didn't answer his phone. It was that moment when she realized she'd fallen in love with him. She'd forgiven him the moment she learned what had caused the misunderstanding between them. She'd told him so, repeatedly. Yet Chris insisted on making it up to her by taking her to Galeries Lafayette for some shopping, treating her to fancy French food, and stopping for coffee and croissants at a café on the Champs-Élysées. Amy had nearly fainted when she saw the bill for 2 cups of coffee. Chris had laughed it off and told her to enjoy herself, before surprising her with an Hermes scarf. He was spoiling her rotten, and it needed to stop. But not tonight. Tonight she would soak it all in. Tomorrow they would do more sightseeing. After that it was time to travel back home. And back to reality. Until then, she'd let him spoil her. "How about a glass of champagne?" Chris asked after they'd finished their late dinner. Amy nodded. It wasn't midnight yet, but she was ready for a bit of the famous sparkling wine now. Kais waved at the head waiter, who returned a moment later with 2 filled glasses. He placed one in front of each of them and quietly retreated. Kais didn't take his eyes off her. Amy wondered if she had something stuck on her lip or if her hair was doing something weird. Then she caught a glint of light from the candle on their table hitting something inside her glass. Was it? It couldn't be. Amy picked up the champagne flute for a closer look. Sure enough, a ring was sitting in the bottom of her glass. Go ahead, take it out, Chris encouraged, his voice thick with emotion. Amy's hands were shaking. She almost dropped the glass and lost hold of the ring twice while trying to fish it out with a dessert spoon. Finally she got it and dropped it on her linen napkin. When she looked up, Chris was kneeling in front of her. He took the ring and held it out to her. Amaryllis Gardner, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The world stood still. This had to be a dream. She, Amy Gardner, flower shop owner and simple southern girl, was sitting wrapped in a warm cashmere cardigan under the warmth of a propane heat lamp on the rooftop terrace of one of the best hotels in Paris, a glass of doubtlessly expensive champagne in front of her, with Billionaire, and all-around good guy, Chris Maxwell, on his knee proposing to her. This couldn't possibly be real. The illuminated Eiffel Tower was right in front of her, and soft music was playing in the air around them. It had to be a dream. Honey? She could feel Chris's hand in hers. It felt strong and solid, and brought her back to reality. Her heart started beating again, and the world continued to turn. This was real. She truly was here, and he had just asked her to spend the rest of her life with him. She smiled so widely that it felt like her lips might split. Amy could see her own joy reflected in Chris's eyes. Yes. I'll marry you. The end. This has been The Billionaire's Christmas Wish. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2019 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2022 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.